Everybody, let's,
Senior county.
we're starting. All right, children, behave. We're ready to start the January 6th meeting of the Wheat Ridge Study Session. And I'm asking for public comment now. Do we have anyone speaking? Okay, oh, we do. All right. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jerry Nealon, Nealon. I have a business at 6770 West 38th Avenue in Wheat Ridge. And I just want to see if I can ask a couple questions as far as the maybe studying to get rid of the back-end parking. There are some businesses on behalf of the leadership committee that kind of enjoy those, that, as far as, loading equipment and things like that. So there are some businesses that kind of enjoy the back-end parking. And my question is why do we need to kind of waste money toward studying whether the parking should go away in the meantime, when I thought the study that was done, the back-end parking is going to go away? So, I mean, I'm sure there's some people that can't back-end park, refuses to back-end park or whatever, and there are parking lots available for those people that they can, use those facilities. And I don't feel they'd probably be parallel parking anyway if they can't use the back-end parking, but anyway, that's head-in parking. I don't know if that would be another option anybody is talking about, but that would make it very dangerous backing out into the bicycle lane. So I'm just kind of not thrilled with that. So anyway, I guess, just bottom line, the investigation's kind of already been done. The back-end parking is slated to go away. So my question is, why would we invest money for another study when the study's already been done? That's it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have anybody else for public comment?
Mark Eskow, E-S-K-O-W. I am in agreement with Jerry, myself. I believe at this point it is a safety issue. Driving in tonight, I saw people that had backed in at night with the lines covered with snow, and they still backed in. So they're catching on, and although it hasn't been a fan favorite, as Jerry mentioned, it's something that we're going to address when we make changes, if we make changes. And I would just like to see the money being used going forward with the project and just make it a win-win all around.
Thank you. Any more public comment? Thank you.
My name is Steve Prose. I live at 4290 Reed Street. I've been a resident of Wheat Ridge for 60 years. I was a volunteer fireman for 25 years, retired in 2003. And the back-end parking is a horrible thing, especially as driving a fire truck down 38th Avenue. And I think it should be stopped. And it sounds like the study that it is already scheduled to be canceled anyway. But 38th Avenue is really narrow right there at that point there, and back-end parking just makes it even worse. I leave at 5:30 in the morning, no problem, come back in the afternoon, and I avoid 38th Avenue, especially that area right there around Teller Street, as much as possible. So it should be canceled. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And are there any more? No more public comment? Okay. Move on to the approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda as it's listed in our sheet here? No? Okay, seeing none, we can move on. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items. Well, 4. Starting with Carl New, and you've read his credentials. And Carl, we've all been looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
I know many of you have been on this council for some time.
so as a result, and that's not just the economy, it's also a number of other factors contributing to this. A lot of federal policy changes occurring. State is running tight on money because they're getting impacted heavily by federal policies. And so the next thing you know, the monies that used to come down from the state are no longer available. You see a big increase in unfunded mandate efforts in a lot of states, people pushing back against them. And also you have aging populations, changing demographics, changing needs, et cetera. And so as a result, there's always a lot of pressure and makes our jobs a lot harder. And so what I want to get you to think about, though, is the future, because that's the only thing you can influence. You can talk about the past, you can change, you can lament it, you can praise it, you can curse it, but the only thing that you have influence over is the future of where you're taking this community. And so as a result, leadership has to do, and governance, with that concept. Let me make sure I know how to do this now. Okay, here we go. And so one of the things I want to get you to think about is advancing to the future, because that's what you have influence over in your community. Now, you're not the only game in town, and I'm the first one to admit that. But it's interesting when you start to think about a council. In your case, you have 9 members. When I was on the Lakewood one, we have 11, et cetera. And councils, the group of you now that form the council, you have unique influence and authority collectively. Influence and authority that no others have in the community. Others may have different types of influence, the business community, the religious community, the educational community, you name it. But a great deal of what happens in your community, one of the responsibilities is to think about how do we meet the challenges that are out there? And there are a lot of them. And they're not going to go away. The second thing, there's opportunity and challenge. We went through a long history in this country where we had what seemed to be an inexhaustible amount of wealth. And we developed what happened with a lot of organizations that have wealth. They stop thinking and they just spend to solve their problems. And so as a result, one of the things that happens is there are opportunities out there when challenges occur. And that goes back to the bottom here about having to begin the world anew. This is a quote from a man named Bernard Bailyn, who is a professor at Harvard Kennedy School, because in many cases, the history of Wheat Ridge is not going to be the predetermining factors of the future of Wheat Ridge. There are going to be different factors playing. And so as a result, one of the things that also becomes important is we have to have a sense of vision. Where are we going? One of the things I see a lot of governing boards that I've worked with in the private sector, the nonprofit sector, the city sector, government sector, is that they're creatures of the moment. What's the long-term vision you're pursuing? Think about it, for example, how many of you have built a new house? How many of you have gone on a really great vacation? It wasn't that spontaneous in many cases. You thought about it, you planned. You took incremental steps to put in place each of the things that were necessary for that to happen. The next thing that happens too is you got to have courage. Sometimes you have to stand up and say no. Sometimes you have to ask people to make choices as they go through. So as we get into the issues that we're going to be looking at, this job that you've taken on is a good thing it pays you extremely well. But how many of you are familiar with a book about the future? I can't remember the name of it right now. That came out years ago, and it got us to start to think about how futures occur. I don't know if any of you watch television now. There's a program on called Big History, and I watched some of the episodes of it. And what it talks about, it's on 271, my channel, whomever I have for my cable system. What it talks about is that a lot of things are interconnected. In many cases, we don't stop to see that interconnectivity. And one of the things that Toffler, who wrote Future Shock, that was the name of the book, and he talked about the fact that the future comes in waves. It's not a straight line. And let me just give you the 3 examples that he started with. The agricultural wave. The agricultural wave lasted for 6,000 years. And it was dominated by living on the land, a feudal political system where lords and high-power people made all the decisions. And then a new wave set in, the Industrial Revolution. It lasted 250 years. But during that time, you saw several things happen. Number one, The wealth was being generated now by manufacturing capacity. The next thing that happened is the demand for public education. Teachers' unions didn't bring us public education. Employers did, because they needed people who knew how to read and write and do arithmetic and so on. Before that, if you wanted an education, you came from a wealthy family or a privileged one. The next one was the information age. And now we're starting to see that one has got a very short life cycle. And other ones are coming in behind it, the bio age, etc. What's happening in all of these waves is they have dramatically different properties from their predecessors. And secondly, they shorten quickly. 6,000 years to 250 to less than 100, etc. What's interesting, though, is the thing that's in between, those little loops. And I want to get you to think about it for a moment. Whoops, let me get back here. Here we go. If you look at this, you have the handouts also. But you notice that there's a loop where the old wave starts to peter out and the new one comes in. That is a very critical phase. Because the thinking anew has to occur in what's known as that discovery leg. And if you don't make it, you don't break through. And then you start coming down the backside, the pain zone. Well, you want to see the pain zone? Go to Detroit. Go to some of the industries that have disappeared, etc. And what's happening to a lot of our government today and institutions is that they enter that pain zone because they haven't made the breakthrough to the next transition point. And while you think about this for a moment, part of the process of governing is that if we're going to bring about the futures that we want, we may have to think dramatically differently of how we were successful in the past. One of the projects I worked with, how many remember Mountain Bell? Telephone company, right? And I had I worked with them for several years on their transition to becoming a sales-oriented company. And if you think about back in the old days with Mountain Bell, how many telephone choices did you have? We had one company. You could have a black telephone or no telephone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, they started to get competition. And Bob Timothy, who was the president of Mountain Bell, called me in one day and he says, "Carl, I'm going to retire." He says, "I have worked for 45 years in this company and I've never learned how to sell anything because I didn't have to. The only customers I had to satisfy were the 5 members of the PUC. And if they bought into it, everybody else was mandated to be a part of it." How do I work this?
There's a little button on towards the end, the other end.
Oh, here it is. Okay, right here. Thank you. And so as a result, the next thing that happens is you start to take a look at where you are in Wheat Ridge or any other organization today. There's some things that really confront us. Number one, we've assumed a role that has great impact in terms of where we're going as a community. The next one is the future isn't a gift. It has to be achieved. That's Robert Kennedy. And so as a result, that means in many cases, as we're working on issues, we'll get into it more in addition, there's a thing called adaptive learning. How must we think anew from how we may have thought in the past? That word is emphasized because it was used by Abraham Lincoln in a cabinet meeting when the cabinet said, well, the country has been torn apart now, all we got to do is do what the founders did. And Lincoln said, no, the nation's already been founded. It's now been torn into 2 pieces. We must think anew because we cannot do what the founders did to bring the nation back together. We have to have whole new processes. And if any of you saw the movie Lincoln and so on, which was the last part of his life, you'll notice that. And the courage that had to go into that. Whoops, using the wrong button. Now you gave me too many buttons. This thing's okay. Now let's go for a second to governance. Governance is not the same as management. I'm going to make a statement now to the city council. You don't run the city. The manager does. You govern the city. Those are different concepts. And governance is defined, if you go back to the work that's been done on leadership by Carver, Defining the needs and ends that are to be met for whom within available resources. Primary role of the council and a board. Requires long-term perspective. Where are we going long-term? If you stop and think about it, we're in a business that has long cycles in it. Infrastructure, utilities, new programs, economic development. Those all don't occur with a wave of one. Some of them have life cycles of 20 and 30 years before they reach fulfillment. When I used to work with the Denver Water Department, not for them, but with them, I always joked about you have a 100-year life cycle. 1 year to decide what the project is, 98 years to go through the lawsuits and harassment, and 1 year to build it. But if you think about it for a moment, it takes long-term perspective. And then you start putting in place what's necessary to reach that long-term outcome. A clear definition of vision and mission. What is our purpose? And more importantly, what is it that we see is the destination point that Wheat Ridge will become if we accomplish all the things we want? It's a journey to the future. But first you must define that future because it's the reference point. Leaders have learned a long time ago, you can't get from here to there without knowing where there is, and then you have to come back to here to make the changes necessary for that there to occur. The next one is policies and directions that reflect and are consistent with the council's long-term visions. One of the things I learned when I was on council, and I see with councils I work with, is people run in with what I call the hot flash du jour. Something that came up, we got to do something right away. But what happens if right away we're doing something that takes resources away from that long-term pursuit? It's a lesson Congress has never learned. People come in, they want something right away, we spend the money, and then when it comes time to do something else, oh, well, we don't have any money anymore. Now, let's go to what it focuses on. Leadership focuses on ends, outcomes. Defining what are the things we want to see achieved for the benefit of whom within available resources. And if we feel strongly enough that we need more resources, how are we going to get them? Do you ever notice when people really want something badly, they're incredibly good at figuring out how to get it? Some cases not legally, but most of the time legally. The next one, aligning people. Getting them to be buying into the vision, supporting it, becoming a part of it. And producing change that makes things happen. Leaders, those of us who are out of the political world now, we're in the change business. If we vision something for the future of our communities, our organization, we're going to have to change current conditions so that we can have the conditions necessary for that future to occur. Otherwise, we'll just keep repeating the past over and over and over again. Now, management focuses on the means, and that's important. Let me just ask you, for the most of you at this table, what is your position within the city? What is yours? Yeah, but what's your title? Councilman. And if you go around, there are 8 other people that have that title. But now let's go to the people who work for the administrative side. What kind of titles do they have? Manager. City manager, police chief, finance director, public works director. You'll notice that every one of those titles has in it a field of expertise they bring to the process of achieving the ends you, the policy setters, want to bring about. I don't know about you, but most policy setters, and I was one of them, I don't have a degree in law, I don't have a degree in accounting, I don't have a degree in human resources, etc. But all of those make up the administrative components of a city. Let me illustrate that another way. We'll put a man on the moon and bring him back safely by the end of this decade. About the same time, the Russians had another saying, we'll put a man on the moon. They had a little social consciousness difference. And if you look back at history, that actually was a problem because they couldn't bring some of the people back for a long time when they were on space up there because they didn't have the money to do it. But Do you think John F. Kennedy knew how to put a man on the moon? I don't think so. We were able to see his transcripts. And he didn't study engineering. He didn't study mathematics. He didn't study science. He was a humanities educated person. But he knew how to find the talent of people who could make it happen. And that's the difference between management and leadership. The skills to bring about the ends. Coping with complexity. Most organizations, and particularly municipal governments, are highly complex organizations. You take a look at the diversity of pursuit that runs the city, you'll find that there are many strategic factors to its success, each one of which requiring different skills, different functions, and different outcomes. And then who orchestrates all of that to come together? Organizing the work of the organization. Now, this is not meant to be casting, as my wife would say, asparagus on anybody. This is Theodore Laurie. He's now deceased. He's quite a prolific writer on government. He says, many organizations and institutions are well managed, but they're poorly led. And there's a lot of truth to that. And it doesn't mean that the people who are in positions of leadership are intentionally bad. It does mean that they may not have a full comprehension of what that function means in the process in terms of leadership. And so, again, it's not meant to be an indictment. It's just meant to be a signal. Now, let's take a look at our impact on community. We can have tremendous impact on our community. Let me give you an example. I had the experience of working with a city in Texas about 20 years ago that went through a rather interesting episode. A city of 38,000 people, and in the last municipal election, the voter turnout was 2%. This is back when this happened. And everybody wondered, what in the heck happened? I mean, hell, one family could take over the city. They got all their relatives down there. And so they went out and they did a lot of conversations with people, a well-organized study, hitting the watering holes, the fast food places, and everything else. And they finally came back with a conclusion that could be expressed in one sentence. Why vote for them? It just encourages them. And what happened in that city was right after that, the Texas legislature, in their wisdom, passed a law that allowed the citizens to roll back a lot of previous tax increases. Next thing you know, police department was cut in half, public works department was reduced, the libraries were closed, street maintenance ended, and so it took that city over 10 years to get out of that funk. Because the governing bodies that had been in office for a while created nothing but cynicism in the community and their loss of faith in their government. But the other side of it is that we have tremendous power to get people excited, to bring about things that happen. Imagine a great city, San Antonio, Federico Peña, etc. And people got excited about those things, and they got behind it. Because a city is not built from 9 people. It's built from everybody in the city in terms of being a part of it. So we do have that impact. We can inspire, we can motivate, we can get people excited if it's a thing they want to buy into and a vision they want to see for their community. Now, let's start with some elements of governance. It always starts with people. Remember, the beginning of democracy is demos, the Greek word for people. The next one is perspective. How do we see things? Do we see things big picture, long term, interrelationships of complex interactions? Or do we see things as immediate things that have to be done short term? Basically, a definition of a reactive city council. Secondly, process. Do we have good processes to make decisions, to get things done, to stay on track, to bring about the outcomes we expect and want? Partnerships. Working with others in the community who can bring resources to it, talent to it. If you go into an average community, there is immense potential for achievement in the talent that's inherent in that community. but who's the conductor of the orchestra in many cases? And then, of course, the outcome is performance. What actually happened? Now, let's go to some other elements. Competence. We hear a lot about that today. And competence means that we really, truly continue to keep learning about what it means to do our job well in a highly effective manner. Let's face it, the beauty of elected office, if you stop to think about it, in our country, with the exception of sheriffs, because in some cases they have to be certified law enforcement officers, coroners in some cases who may have had at least driven by a medical school sometime in their life, and possibly judges who might have gone to law school, which, by the way, in Texas you can have judges who don't go to law school. But if you think about it for a moment, most of us, when we come into this role, competence was not a requirement for our election. And that's not meant to be pejorative. The founders of this nation wanted every person to have access without litmus tests to public office. But the question then becomes what it took to get us elected to office doesn't necessarily mean we have the skills to be effective in that office. All of us ran as individuals, making promises, making comments, making observations. Once we get to be on the council, we now are part of a group that makes decisions and choices. And so there is a learning curve that occurs in this. And there's also a learning curve as circumstances change. Things become more complex. Right now, if you're like, for example, in Lakewood, where I come from, redevelopment, that was a big issue for us down there because we built the city up from virtually nothing. And the next thing you know, we had to then start to rebuild it. That meant rethinking a whole lot of things. And it's true of most communities. Conviction, courage, and a sense of community. I won't go into those in great depth. Now, governance starts with people, as I said, and how they interact with each other. So let's take a look at a city council. It's an interesting concept. If you step back and gain a perspective, the council is a person. It is the person that has the authority to govern this city. Its members have no authority in and of themselves. And that's an important concept because the council, the term governing body, has meaning. It's a corporate person. And if you look at the law, excuse me for practicing it for a moment, you'll find that a corporate person in many cases has similar capacities and authority and prerogatives that a human person has, and similar accountability. The corporate person is comprised of human beings. We're the organs in that body, if you will. Now, in the case of your city, a team of 9 humans who came together to animate the person legally who has the authority to govern. And that's an important concept because we are a component in a whole, where as a whole we must operate to make that whole the voice. Now, it doesn't mean we can't have our differences in between and so on. I'm going to get into that. And that opens up the issues of team and teamwork. Now, cars go driving down out here on Wadsworth, particularly after a nice weekend, and you see cars going by and people are screaming and there are flags flagging on their car. What's typically on those flags? What names? Broncos. Maybe the Rockies if they have a good week, etc. We love team as entertainment and advocation. But as a culture, we're not comfortable with it because we have a counterculture that gives us some issues. We are a society of moists, emphasis on the individual. And so a team and individualism have to figure out how do they come into becoming a team. A team is defined as a group of people with disparate backgrounds and talents. Look around this table, look around any table or group that I've been a part of too. It's the same thing. Different people with different talents, different backgrounds who've come together collectively to achieve something that they can only accomplish collectively because the team members do not have the authority to do it individually, or in many cases, even the capacity to do it individually. And more, we're becoming a society of teams. Look at medicine. Look at scientific development now. Most large corporations and high-tech industries and so on. There's no one individual with all the genius. There are people with different training and backgrounds who come together collectively to develop a new product, to carry out a complicated surgical procedure, etc. Relationships and coordination then become vital to the issue of teamwork. How do we get what is accomplished, has to be accomplished by that corporate being. And that opens up two issues, the two S's. One is systemicness, which means that when you got sworn in, you became a part of this council. When you were employed, for those of you on staff by the city, you became a part of the organization of the city of Wheat Ridge. It doesn't mean you're going to be functional or dysfunctional. It just means that you are now connected by virtue of coming together within a certain relationship. The next S is the one that's important, synergy, where the team accomplishes collectively an outcome greater than the individual contributions of all the team members. That's synergy. How many of you have ever been in a team situation that's really hot, where they're really clicking? And you'll notice that all of a sudden, that interaction really gives them a new life force in terms of how they come together to get things done. Now, for those of you that are engineers, that's called systems theory, where the whole determines the need of the parts don't determine what the whole does. Let me give you an example. How many of you drove here tonight? Well, if you were never seen a car and you went into somebody's auto parts store and you saw all the parts and you'd never seen a car, there is no way you could determine if you put those parts into a certain arrangement, interacting in a certain way, that you would have an automobile that produced the synergistic thing called transportation. Now look at the person next to you. That person's a system. Many of the parts in their body are singular parts. There are a few duplications. But it's the interaction of those parts that give you health and vitality. And the synergistic outcome is life. When you die and the coroner doesn't get a chance to get a crack at you, all those parts are still connected. But they're not interacting anymore. And what can happen also is that one of those parts, if it becomes way out of whack, can put the entire body at risk. It's called pathology. And so as a result, the two S's become extremely important when you think of governance. Sure, they're all pedigreed, but are they a team? This was given to me by a city manager who had the pleasure of working for Governor Ventura. And if you look at that slide, take that sled, the vision for your community. And all those dogs there are certified pedigrees. Where are they going to take that sled? Nowhere. But all of a sudden, let's suppose they really get their act together. They can take that sled about anywhere. Now, let's go to the next one. Some barriers to teamwork. One, absence of trust. The second one, fear of conflict. Conflict is a natural part of the human experience. How many of you have ever had a disagreement with your spouse? With your children? Conflict is basically defined as when one person perceives that what he or she wants is incompatible with what the other person perceives and wants. It happens all the time in very productive relationships. How many of you have had conflict with your children? How many of you have had conflict with your teenagers when they're going through the they know-it-all phase? I have a grandson in that phase. I just love being with him. He knows it all, Grandpa. Step back after he screws it up, and I said, okay, Brian, now let's talk about how you could have done it. Okay. The next one is avoidance of responsibility. and civility. And the next one is lack of attention to results. Now, let's go one step further. Not a trick question. Was I elected to do what people want or to govern well? It's a compound sentence intentionally. Because in the short term, if you look at it, it can be a situation of conflict. Suppose people want something that is not responsible for the future of the community. Let's cut taxes. Oh yeah, that's a great one. What happens if we don't have enough money to pave the streets? We lose a lot of our good employees, like the Sheriff's Department in Jefferson County has done right now with 80 deputies, etc. Contrast, let's suppose, for example, that people also they don't want to live in a community that's deteriorating, but they also want us to govern well. In the long term, I would submit that the question gets answered with a yes on both sides. But sometimes it creates a conflict for us who are elected officials, or in my case was. Right? And that is, what people want frequently are short-term interests and narrowly defined desires. How often do we have somebody comes before us and say, oh, I see what we're trying to do, and I'm willing to sacrifice for the next several years to help make that happen? Or do you get the I want it now syndrome? The hot issue du jour. And so as a result, we can't ignore those. We still have to listen, and we should. But the other side of it is, to govern well means focusing on long-term strategic factors affecting the very future of the community. Things that must occur if we're going to bring about the future we envision and desire for our community, and that we have the discipline to stay with them. Now, one part, as I pointed out, it's important to listen, very important, and to even be empathetic in many cases, concerns in a reasoned, responsible, timely manner. The next part of it is, here we go. Governance is about leadership and stewardship. I'm going to define those in a minute because they're not the same thing. We're going to find from history in a few moments that the leaders of our country created something that was unsustainable. And later people had to come in with a concept of stewardship to give them the capacity to sustain it. This requires, here we go, I want to get to this one. Governing and managing a city. It is complex. I've already talked about that. And one of the things that becomes extremely important in policy making and decision making and planning is that we're making decisions that benefit rather than harm the future of the community. Extremely important. And there's something else. Many of those things will not come to fruition during our term on council. We in Colorado, with few exceptions, are term limited. And so in many cases, the city council is like when I was in high school. Can't believe I used to run track. You wouldn't admit it now. But if you think about it for a moment, it's like a baton race. You may be one member of that carrying a baton who passes it on to your successors, who pass it on to their successors until the 20 and 30-year horizon has gotten to the goal post or the end post. But each decision also has consequences. It's important to anticipate what are those consequences. Detroit is a classic example of that. Most of the cities going bankrupt in this country are a classic example of that. When they entered into agreements that there was no way they could financially create the resources to honor those agreements. Pension plans in many cases, and so on. So they were very popular at the moment, but long term, they were devastating. Now, what do leaders really do? Leaders produce change. Managers deal with the complexity of bringing about dealing with that change. If you think about it, that simple concept by John Kotter from the Harvard Business School ties down quickly the model of government that you're practicing, the council manager model. Our job as leaders in that model is to decide what is the outcomes we're looking for whom, and what changes must we encourage and occur to bring it about. And then we turn to the Patrick Goffs of the world and say, if you remember the old Star Trek man with Jean-Luc, make it so. Because in many cases, we don't have the talent to bring it about. And that doesn't mean we are not good people. We have a different function. The next thing is leadership and stewardship. Some of you may remember the name of Cronin. He's a professor now at Colorado College, well-known political writer. In fact, he had an article in the paper just the other day in the Denver Post. And this is his quote: "Leaders make things happen that might not otherwise happen." Now, think in your mind for a moment what you'd like the future of Wheat Ridge to be, and ask yourself, will this occur just because I want it to? And the answer, if you're realistic, is no. You're going to have to get out there and make things happen that might not otherwise happen. It's also preventing things from happening that just might happen if we fail to act. For example, how many of you remember Westland Shopping Center? The old Villa Italia. Well, if you'll notice, those things were becoming the canker sore of urban decay in both of those areas, because the people who owned them didn't want to give up the control of the land. And if you go around them, property values are going down, businesses were leaving, crime was going up, properties were deteriorating, etc. So then the question becomes, if you don't deal with it, are you willing to live with those long-term consequences? Well, it got dealt with, and we're not alone. A lot of other cities, take a look at what's happened in Denver with a lot of things under the leadership of people like Pena and so on. Transforming visions into reality, actions into results. But then comes the issue of stewardship. Ensuring the capacity that means necessary to sustain and preserve the future we intend to create. I mentioned a little bit earlier the Founding Fathers. In 1776, they came together in a moment of absolute brilliance by a group of people who had an uncanny understanding of human nature. Because as Madison said, if all people were angels, we wouldn't need government. But they're not. So therefore, we need government that limits their lesser behaviors rather than encourages them. And that's one of the reasons we have a constitution, you'll find out in a little bit, that actually has the issue of limitation in it. There's a reason for that. But within several years, quickly became evident that the nation that was founded in 1776 would not survive. And if any of you read 1776, McCullough's book on George Washington as commander of the Continental Army, he couldn't recruit, he couldn't pay his troops, he couldn't get cannon, he couldn't get munitions, he couldn't get food, and so on. And finally, it got so bad that Massachusetts and New York decided to secede from the Union. Go back to being the colonies slugging it out with each other. And in 1788, a group of men came together, many cases new faces, and they gave us the Constitution. And it was the Constitution that gave us this new creation, the sustainability to prevail. We are the longest running example of democratic society in the history of humankind. And it's less than 250 years old. Now there's something else. To a leader and a steward, the needs of the future take precedent over the demands of the present. For mastering the challenges we face, decision-making, and resource allocation. This is where it gets tough to be a political leader. When we say we are set out to do these things, And no, we're not going to divert resources from it, because if we do, we will not accomplish the outcome we're trying to accomplish. What is the future we desire, and how are we going to go about achieving it? Now, that takes us then to something else. Leadership means influencing the community to face its challenges and opportunities. In many ways, the most important part of our job is not around the console table up here. It's out in the community, being a spark plug for positive change, encouraging people, etc. And to think anew, as we've already pointed out, or I have. Now, some basic wisdom. I love Mark Twain, because like I'm a cynic. Along with W.C. Fields and Will Rogers. And actually, a lot of people don't realize it, Adlai Stevenson, remember him? Ran against Eisenhower for the presidency in '52. And in his autobiography, he had a wonderful sentence. It's the only thing I remember in the whole autobiography. Do you ever notice that everybody sees the handwriting on the wall when you ram their face into it? And a friend of mine who's a professor at the University of Florida, I have the good fortune of doing some seminars for elected officials down there. He says, you ever notice a lot of politicians, when they see that handwriting on the wall, they think the message is for somebody else. But if you think about it for a moment, what Twain said is, it isn't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. There's a lot of myth in this business we're in. Growth is bad, taxes are bad, etc. Well, growth is not bad if it's well managed. Try to be a community that doesn't grow. If taxes bring you something you value, and it's a fair price for it, and you really want it, then it's good. If they're exploitive and do a lot of things that produce outcomes you don't want, then they're not good, etc. Now, habits of highly effective consuls, and I'll go through these very quickly because you hopefully all read the article. Think and act strategically. Big picture. Now, let me open that up. Strategy is entirely different than tactics, and we live in a society that is very good at tactical action. The quick fix. Heck, we've been in Afghanistan for 42 seconds. The war ain't over yet, etc. And we've been good at it. We built a nation around good thinking, quick solutions, practical outcomes. And we even hired a philosopher to help us give a name to it. It's called pragmatism. But strategy is a different way of thinking. Long term. The word strategy comes from strategos, the Greek definition of the stuff of generals. Generals do not fight wars. They plan campaigns to be carried out in the field by their field commanders. Eisenhower did not lead the invasion into Normandy, but he was the campaign controller of Project Overlord, which was the invasion into Europe to defeat the Nazi Empire. Bradley led the troops into the field, and so on. Tacticos is thinking on the ground, dealing with a lot of things quickly, and practically. Both are extremely important, and particularly when we're thinking long-term in a community. To think strategically, as generals are thinking about, what's the campaign we're trying to achieve? What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? What resources must we need? What talents must we need? Who do we bring in who are the people that have the skills to make the things we want happen? The next one, shared constituency. Let me ask you a quick question. How many of you live in the state? Few. Some of you just passing through to get to the marijuana store? Okay. Bad joke. Next one. How many of you live in a county? How many of you live in a city? Boy, every hand in the room better go up around this table. How many of you live in a school district? How many of you live in a special district or more than one? We're proliferating. We have over 5,000 of them, I understand now, in Colorado. Somebody told me recently 7,000. But if you stop to think about it, all of those jurisdictions have elected officials They have the power to regulate, they have the power to tax. But how many sets of constituents are there? There's one. All those institutions share the same body of people. Now, that's not such a bad idea, because we know we're all going to get together with these various groups and work out a common agenda where we each contribute our respective contribution for the good of the total community, and everything will be harmony, collaboration, and teamwork. Right? Yeah, right. Like Shrek said, yeah, like that's going to happen, right? And so, but you think about it for a moment, we do have a shared constituency. The question then becomes, how do we then work with these other jurisdictions to get things done in a productive way? Rather than being in conflict with them, competing for resources with them, etc. Because they're all the same people we represent. And this is something that's starting to get, people are catching on to, is that the over-fragmentation of government is not an asset for a lot of communities. Because the fragmented parts don't act in that concept of teamwork. The next one, teamwork, we've talked about that for a moment already. I'm going to go back. I'm sorry for this button here. Small group decision making. The typical council in the United States is 10 or fewer people. You're 9. We happen to be 11 in Lakewood. A lot of them are 7. Very few are 5 in Colorado. But you go to other states, like I'll be in Minnesota in the next couple of days, they're the predominance up there, 5-member councils. They have other exceptions to it. Small group decision making is dramatically different than when you go down, for example, in large groups. Go down and watch the state legislature in action. And there are cities that have large councils. Milwaukee has 28, Boston has 40, etc. Chicago has over 40, New York has over, I think, 39. But if you watch them operate, they don't operate the same way we do. I mean, I like when you go into the city hall in Milwaukee and you walk into the chambers, they call it the municipal assembly. And when you see the council chambers, it looks just like a miniature version of the House of Representatives office hearing room in downtown Denver. Little desks, speaker's table at the front, and so on. And in those cases, the strong mayor model, the mayor is not a member of council, therefore does not participate in its proceedings. The council president is the proceeding officer of the council. You see that in Denver. Strong mayor model. Mayor Hancock does not participate in the meetings of the council, etc. It's a separation of powers model that came from the old traditional model of the federal government and the state government. Unfortunately, it lent itself to some problems, 3 C's: corruption, collusion, and cronyism. And it got so corrupt around the country that in the early 1900s, there was a tremendous shift towards a new form of government, which we are enjoying in this community today, and mine too, the council manager form of government. Different principles, totally. It's a corporate model. Council is the board of directors, manager and staff is the president and operating officers of the organization. Actually came out of General Motors. The next one is clearly defined roles and relationships in terms of how we work with each other. What do we do? What's the role of the mayor, for example? What's the role of a council member? And to understand that role. Honoring the governing body staff partnership. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Those of us who are from the elected side, we are tremendously dependent upon the staff. Not only to give us information, but to carry out what needs to be done to make sure the organization not only performs well, but achieves well also on our long-term goals and direction for the city. That's a sense of partnership. It's extremely important. I'm going to open that one up a little bit. Use of your time and energy. How many of you, once you got sworn in to be sworn at on council, gave up your job, came down and asked Patrick if you could have a little room here in City Hall because you're going to be here for the next 4 years, told your family you might drop by occasionally and see how they're doing, because you're now a full-time person serving the city. We're not. We're part-time. If you think about it for a moment, the body that governs, in most cases, is actually in action less than 200 hours a year. Take the council meetings you have and the work sessions you have when you convene as a body, add up all the time, and then take the amount of time that Patrick serves here as city manager. So you're going to find there's a tremendous disparity there. How many of you have heard of the concept quality of time? It's extremely important. How do we use our time if we only get together for a couple hundred hours out of the year and get things done? It doesn't mean you're not doing a lot of other individual things in the representational model. And I give you great credit for that. Clear rules and procedures, systematic and valid assessment of policy. You sit down and evaluate, where are we on some of these long-term goals, on these policies? And talk to the manager and the staff about it in appropriate settings. Or do you wait for the time-honored concept of the fecal ventilator collision to bring your attention to a problem? Think about it, you'll get it. And as my assistant says, God bless her, she said, you notice, Carl, every time a fecal ventilator collision occurs, the proceeds are never distributed evenly. And then we got a crisis. Boy, everybody's hotter than a cat on a hot tin roof now about this issue until it blows over. And we're back to the old methods of doing things. Personal learning and humor. There's a reason we televise council meetings. They're good sitcom. Now that's being facetious a little bit, but it's amazing how many people actually tap into government access television. Now maybe they're like me, channel surfing, but they do pay attention. There's a relatively high viewership in most communities, fair to speak. Now let's open just a couple of these up in detail, and one of them is performance areas. Whoops, got ahead of myself here. Hang on just a second. Here we go. Decision, strategic leadership, first one. Defining the future you want and inventing the ways to make it happen. That's a statement from Russell Akoff. He's now deceased. He was a professor at Wharton School of Management. I had the pleasure of working with him on some projects with AT&T, and really an interesting individual. He says, once you define what you want, then invent the ways to make it happen. And they don't even have to be legal. You didn't know him. How many of you actually went to a telephone company other than 8 Mile Bell while they were still around? Like United Business Systems, remember them, et cetera? You were aiding and abetting in a legal operation. Because the Telecommunications Act still gave the monopoly to AT&T. How many of you have little plastic passports to poverty in your wallet right now? Called credit cards, debit cards. When they first came out, most of them were illegal. Glass-Steagall Act said banks bank, brokers broke, and they can't give credit cards, etc. And yet, at one time, the largest holder of public debt in the United States for people doing things was Sears and Roebuck. And how did they get away with it? Well, Merrill Lynch started to give out checking accounts. They started to give out credit cards and so on. The next thing you know, the bankers moved in and shut them down. The head of Merrill Lynch said, take us to court. We want you to sue us. And AT&T said the same thing to all of the companies who are competing with them. Take us to court. We want you to sue us. And the reason they did is that we live in a common law country. The biggest myth is that the legislature makes laws. They don't. They pass them. The courts confirm them. And so they were counting on, AT&T and Merrill Lynch and others, that the courts would strike down the Telecommunications Act or neutralize it, and the Glass-Steagall Act, which is exactly what the Supreme Court did. It only it took Congress another 20 years to repeal those laws. But the courts had already struck them down. So as a result, we can invent a lot of ways to get things done. For example, in government, I see a lot of communities do this, and we did it in Lakewood with the Walmart down at Wadsworth and Colfax, with Colorado Mills, with Belmar Commons. We used OPM to finance all the projects, other people's money. We got the developers to pay for it all, and then we gave them a tax district to get their money back. And the city didn't put in a dime. They created a mechanism that was a win-win for all parties to get it done. It turned out to be over $300 million worth of public improvements. Now, I'll skip the stretch break. Performance areas. I want to get into these for a moment, because we'll finish early. Goal setting. Do you have retreats every year? Good. Good place to go. There's a chart in there in a few minutes you can look at in the handout back. Getting out of the room, going out somewhere, letting your hair down. For some of us, that's a little more difficult than others. And having some fun and talking about the future. Playing what if. Having a sense of humor. Exploring ideas. When I do these kind of workshops, get them to draw pictures on the wall. Show me what Wheat Ridge is going to look like 20 years from now in your dream of dreams. And then talk about them. Share them. An amazing thing has happened. In the 45 years I've been in this business, I've seen an 85% concurrence rate in those visions. But we argue about the 15%. Because we never shared those visions with each other. And what are the common themes in them? The next one, exploration and analysis. It's called a workshop. Study sessions. Where we learn an issue to the point that we can honestly make a competent decision we can defend once we've made it. And that means talking back and forth, asking staff to give us input, doing what if, what are the consequences, are there alternatives, how can we bring it about, etc. All the things we need to know before we get to these chambers to make a final decision so that we're prepared. My grandson was at Arapahoe High School. He was in that tragedy. Now this week he's taking his final exams. And he's been out of school for over 2 weeks. I said, Brian, are you really prepared to take the exams now? Or do you just forget all that good stuff? You had to go back and get prepared again. The next one, disposition and legislation. Purpose of this council table. Think of your council agenda for a moment. What is its basic purpose? Disposition. I sometimes use the statement, the Roman emperor trick, live, die, table. If you think about it. Our purpose in this meeting is to get all those items off the agenda through official action to dispose of them. Because that's its purpose. But were we prepared to get there to make a wise decision in the disposal process? Without then having to wing it at this table and ask a lot of questions, which if asked inappropriately, put other people's credibility at risk in the eyes of the audience. Mr. Goff, why didn't you think of that when you brought this issue before us? What did I just do to him? You can say things like that in a study session. It's open-ended with some courtesy, etc. The next one is community engagement. Extremely important. And more it's becoming more important. Now, this table is in the back of your handouts. So there also. Goal setting is the retreat. Recommended highly. Have fun with it. You can see all the descriptions there of what it's about. The big chart. Exploration and analysis. Study session. Open to the public. I recommend that the public not be a part of that discussion at that time. They're not a member of council. Your job is to learn from each other and the staff, what are we looking at here? Now, can the public comment to you about it? Of course. A lot of councils have an open where people can comment at the end of the work session is for the consul to learn and the staff to learn also from the consul. What are the concerns of the consul? What do they want to achieve? What are our options? What are our alternatives? And sometimes if it's a very complicated issue, it may take more than one work session to wade your way through it. Because it's extremely important to get it right when you get to the point then finally deciding which policy direction you're going to take and why, which then happens when you have an ordinance or resolution. The next one, as I mentioned, is disposition analysis. Now, I'm going to make a statement, and some of you may take umbrage to it. Leadership typically doesn't occur at this table. It occurs around this table and in the goal-setting sessions. That's when you really exercise leadership. What do we have to talk about? What are the things we need to change, etc. And then you confirm up here through final decision which policy we're going to take. Because the interesting thing is that corporate being made up of 9 human organs has to speak with one voice. Its voice is the one that has heard what the policy direction says. Let me give you an example. Suppose you have a developer that comes in and he wants to build 90 units. And he needs permission to get the zoning change to do that. And the vote is 5-4. As Mayor Jay said, Mr. Developer, congratulations, your request has been approved. However, the vote was 5-4. You're only able to build 50 units. It's not the way it works. And that's why it's extremely important, is that when the council articulates that voice, it's a sense of direction you're all committed to follow to bring that outcome to reality. The debate should occur here and in the study sessions, not after the decision has been made. That's a hard part of the discipline. Watch the teams that really work. When the clay is called and they go out there, they all say, well, you know, I'm running out of here, but I think I'll change what the plan was, etc. Now that's called consensus. And you have to work at it sometimes to get it. Maybe sometimes you won't. Consensus doesn't mean unanimity. It means that you've reached a decision where you felt you were heard and respected. It may not have been the decision you would like to have seen, but you're going to commit yourself now to make it happen when the council's voice articulated that decision. Let me give you an example. City in Minnesota. We're going to build a large aquatic center, Latin for very expensive swimming pool. Mayor was vehemently opposed to it. 7-member council. Came time, after lots of public discussion, lots of meetings within the council and study sessions, the vote was taken, and it was 6-1 against, 4, Mayor. Where do you think all the reporters ran at the end of the meeting? Mayor, what are you going to do about this? It's not that I'm going to build the best damn aquatic center this city has ever imagined. He said, I didn't prevail, and now it's my job to make sure that the will of the body will be achieved. Now, let's go, here we go. And we're pretty much getting ready to wrap it up. Unfortunately, the routine pressures that we face sometimes move us away from that. Highly structured council meetings, think about them. There's an agenda. The pressure, not the pressure, but the momentum is to get those items decided. Yay, nay, move on. They come off the agenda. And none of those things are going to go off the agenda until there's a vote, with the exception of the invocation and the welcome and opening comments and that sort of thing. But then, that's not a forum for open exchange of a lot of ideas. That's the work of the study session and the retreat. The what ifs. Energy to focus. You're all busy. I imagine most of you have other occupations in your life. This is truly, in many ways, a part-time job. And so as a result, that time has to be used judiciously. And we need a good strategic base, a good strategic plan. Where do we see Wheat Ridge 20 years from now? Where are we going to take it to? What are the factors that matter? Let me give you an example. How many of you are familiar with the 80-20 rule? One of the things I've observed in working with organizations and particularly local governments is that the reality is for most of us at this area is the 93-7 rule. 7 factors will be of such strategic importance to the future of our community's success that they'll determine 93% of the outcome if we manage them properly. We'll make up the rest as we go along. And they can be things like economic development, infrastructure, etc. But they're absolutely quintessential pillars for success. Have we identified them? Have we figured out how we're going to deal with these to bring about the outcome we have in our vision? And they become the primary focal point of our concern, to get those 7 factors right. The next factor that becomes extremely important about it then is good policy setting. So that the staff and administration knows what it is you expect. You give them the guidelines so that they can make incremental decisions. For example, a good comp plan. Because if you take a look at your building and planning department and so on, we have people come in all the time and they want a little piece of this thing. My wife likes to do 1,000-piece crossword puzzles. And if you think about it, if you got a good view of what that big puzzle looks like, you can examine every piece and say, does this fit into bringing about the fruition of this big picture? Because in many cases, the administrative decisions are evaluating those pieces. Somebody comes in and wants that project. Somebody comes in and wants this permit. Somebody comes in and wants something else. That's the daily stuff over the counters of the organization. But where's the policy guidelines and decision-making tools that we provide to the CONT staff for them to see how those pieces fit together? And in the absence of a strategic perspective, you can drift at becoming a reactionary consul. It happens to a lot of communities. And as a result, they wind up always responding. I remember high school biology classes, the amoebal in the petri dish. You put a little shock in it, it goes whoo, 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 all around the dish when the little shocks occur. Rather than focusing on what are the real issues that need to be done. Proactive consul, solid strategic base. And that opens up with boldness. If you can dream it and see it, you can begin it. Boldness has magic, power, and genius in it. Goethe, 18th century German philosopher. Those 2 lines come from a 3-paragraph long excuse of why I can't do something. The real quote is 3 paragraphs long. When he finally said, if I can see it and dream it, how many of you in this room have ever daydreamed? Okay, I'm going to up the ante. How many of you have fantasized? Okay, now we're really going to up the ante. How many of you have acted out some of your fantasies? Of course, within reason. I hope the answer is yes to all of those. The human mind is incapable of not fixating on the future in one way or another. It's a future-seeking device. But do we have bold thoughts? And then the magic, power, and genius in it. And what Goethe pointed out in his quote is that once you start to get this thing coming and rolling, you all of a sudden discover a tremendous potential for success you couldn't never appreciated you had. How many of you saw the movie The Hobbit? If you look at Tolkien's thing, The Hobbit, little guy brought in to do something, yeah, I want to do that. The next thing you know, he gained confidence and he became successful. And ultimately, at the end, he becomes a leader. There's a great book written years ago, or somebody may have read it rather, Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Bach was the author, about how a bird that ate trash and crud soared to a new potential and went into the heavens and turned into a silver icon. Boldness has magic power and genius in it. But the job of leadership is this, and this is from the mayor of a city in Washington, Linwood, Washington, to explain and understand the times in which we serve. This headline in here is a good example. Being a public to understand. What are we up against? What are we having to deal with? What do we want to achieve? The next one, to have a vision of where we need to go. And I mean truly a mental picture. Not some cute phrase that we're going to be the carnation capital of the world. No asparagus intended. But if you think about it for a moment, draw a picture. The mind is a picture processor. It's not a word processor. You see things in patterns. We had to then figure out triggers. We call them words. But if I say toss-up, well, that'd be cup. But if I say draw me a cup, I bet I get 10 different pictures. Because the words are imprecise. You ever notice leaders, really good leaders, they encourage you to see. Imagine, can you see this? What would it look like if this, you had the outcome you wanted? You'll notice they're always driving your brain to use its vision process. Because it's a vision processor. The next one is a strategy to get there. Okay, here's the outcome I want. Now, how am I going to make it happen? How are we going to make it happen? How is this body of one person with 9 human organs in it going to make it happen? The next one is to execute that strategy and stay with it. Now, do you have to modify it at times? Yes, you had a good example of that brief conversation tonight about a parking issue. I don't know if that's one issue of strategic importance, but it did indicate that every now and then we have to come back and re-examine some of the assumptions we've made. And that's a good process to have. Demonstrate integrity, which means that we stick to what we said we were going to do. And secondly, professionalism in terms of getting things done. Now, this one, you can look in your handout. It's called the iceberg. If you remember icebergs, from anybody, 90% of it's below water. But if you look at the bottom of that iceberg, you'll discover that it's all the stuff you need to make incremental decisions while you're sitting at this table. It's built from many things. For example, down here, starts off with your core values. What's your vision? What are the long-term goals and priorities? What are the guidelines and tools we establish? What master plans do we set into play? You'll notice you look at all of these things. And specific performance objectives, they're tools, groundwork for final decision making. So when you get to a council meeting, which everybody sees up here, the incremental decisions, every one of those decisions is made within the confines of having all of that thinking in place so that you can see where it is. Otherwise, you just live for the moment up here. That's why the strategic planning process is absolutely critical. Now, what's in a strategic plan? Basically 4 elements. The vision for the future of the community. And I mean by this, an actual word description of what you see your community to be at some time in the future. Common timeline's 20 years. I get the councils, the people working on them, write a letter from the future to now. And it's going to be in the present tense because you're out 20 years from now, and that's your present, and you're coming back now to the people in the past because they still have a chance to make decisions to get to that future. The second one, strategic focus areas. I've talked about those. What are those predominant factors, and do you agree on them? The third area is 5-year goals. Now, why 5 years? If you take a look at an organization such as a city, like most organizations, they have natural rhythms of how they do things. You meet every 2 weeks as a council. I think you meet also for work sessions, right, every 2 weeks? Maybe or maybe not. Our council used to. You have a capital improvement plan. It has a 5-year cycle for investment, where you're putting money into things that require significant contributions of resources over a long period of time. There's an old saying, you manage an organization strategically through your investments. You operate it through your operating budgets. Where you invest your money is whether or not you're supporting those strategic focus areas. We've bastardized this word. Everything is an investment now to Washington. Even wasting money. We're investing and wasting our money, etc. But if you think about it for a moment, we have to have that 5-year cycle down pat. In some cases, cities go out longer. I have several cities I work with that have 10 and 20-year capital plans, because they know that once they make the commitment to dealing with that focus area, they can't piecemeal it every year. They have to continue to ensure those resources will be available year by year by year to get it finished. Number 5, next one then is 2-year performance objectives. Where does the 2 years come from? It's called the time between elections. You're now in one of those phases. So as a council, you can tell what you want to achieve. Over the next 2 years, these are the things we want to see achieved in terms of outcomes that we will fund in the budget the city manager will bring to us. And those will also become the basis for his performance appraisal. Did he get them done or not? And then we give him the resources to do it. And they're highly measurable, specific outcomes, not how you're going to get there, what we want to see the outcome look like and be. How is his problem or issue. Now, goals and performance objectives, they set priorities and direction. They focus on the what, not the how. Drive the budget and resource allocation. Some finance directors say, oh, the budget's a plan. I take real umbrage to that. The budget is not a plan. It's an allocation tool to fund a plan. It's achievement. If we see something we want, then we have to have a means of allocating that money. That's the budget. That's where the money is going to go, to support that plan to achieve the outcome. The next one, the basis for work planning and performance evaluation. The most important asset you have in this organization to get things done walks in on 2 feet every day. Well, how do you use those people in terms of their talent, their focus, the priorities they're focusing on, what they need to get the job done, etc. That organization of work, that's a management function. The next one is clarify the respective roles of council, the manager, and the staff. Now, let's move into wrapping it up, the partnership for a moment. Staff and partnership. How come this thing's not moving now? What? Oh, okay. Okay, I probably triggered that myself. Okay. Stop and think about our world as elected officials for a moment. How do we get a lot of our information? Ring, ring. I just wanted to call you and let you know that I thought you would be interested in my helping you to develop your long-term plan for business development. I've decided I'm going to ask my company to give me a year's leave of absence, and I'll come down and work with your staff to help you develop that plan. Because I really believe in it. I actually had that happen in a city called Eagan, Minnesota, where a man did that. But it doesn't happen very often. What happens when you get most of your ring rings? I was driving down 38th Avenue and I hit a pothole out there and the whole front end of my car fell apart and you bastards waste all the money and you're a bunch of crooks. Or when you stop, anybody ever stop you in a supermarket? etc. We go around the world and we get little snippets of information. And they're legitimate for a lot of people, because they wouldn't say them to us. My wife and I have, when the kids were growing up, the family bulletin board was the refrigerator door. And she found in our office, Post-its, and she put Post-its on. They had different colors. Each color was an indication of her intensity of interest in this issue. And a penalty was typically associated with it, like red was do or die, this sort of thing. But if you think about it, a lot of the time we went around, oh, we're getting these little pieces of Post-its stuck on us. But if you think about it, in the long many cases, is that becomes a buzz. And if we're not careful, we can bring that buzz into the organization rather than saying, wait a minute, what's the real issue here? What is this symptomatic of? And that's our political world. It's reality. What's the political world, or what's the world of the staff? Expertise, budgeting, work planning. How do we marry those two? Because they just happen to be the nature of the beast, the political world and the administrative world. We did it again. Here we go. Now, how many of you heard Council's role is to set policy, staff's role is administration? Well, that's true to some extent, but it's too simple. Let me give you an example. If you look at the top of that chart, you have it in your handout, we in the council are in the futures business. Almost everything we vote on or approve has not yet happened. When we approve a budget, it hasn't been spent yet. We approve a new master plan, it hasn't been built yet. We approve a contract that hasn't been achieved yet, etc. We're betting on the future. Things that we see that need to be done or committed to bring about, authorized to occur, etc. And then it works its way along that continuum through the input of money, resources, talent, etc., and it becomes a reality. And that's where the partnership comes in. Let me give you another example of that. Suppose you win the lottery. You decide you're going to build yourself with your family a beautiful vacation home. Then you all sit around the dining room table or kitchen table and you start talking about it. At that moment, everybody's got an idea. That's your house at that moment. A bunch of fragmented ideas that you haven't yet been coerced or congealed rather into a definite plan. And then pretty soon you get a blueprint. That's your house also. And that blueprint allows you to define what labor is required, what skills are required, what resources are required, what it's going to look like, what engineering is required, etc. And pretty soon the dirt starts turning. And you work your way through and sooner or later you get the key. It's always been your house. But it went from abstract to concrete. That's a continuum we have with council. That's part of the partnership. And if you look at the top of this chart, the role of council: vision, mission, goals, strategy, resource allocation, policy, and performance evaluation. Down to the bottom of that chart, all of the stuff of administrative actions to make things happen. That's the partnership. Extremely important one. Now, leadership. The call is always before us. It will never cease. Wheat Ridge, as you progress to the future along those waves, will always have calling out to you as a voice, where are we going? And are we going to get there? And how do we do it? It's a siren call. And if we don't answer it, then we discover what's happening to a great extent today in this nation. We fibrillate. And we enter that pain zone if we're not careful. Editorial comment. Thomas Jefferson, when he was in France as the ambassador to France, when the Constitution was being written, so therefore he wasn't a writer of it, was in constant communication with John Adams, who was one of the major contributors to the Constitution, along with Ben Franklin, others. And at one point, there was a great debate about whether or not we should even have an executive branch. Because if we have a president, he'll just become King George I of the United States of America. And finally, Adams prevailed on Jefferson that if we don't have a balance of power between the executive and legislature, we'll have the tyranny of the legislature. And Jefferson acquiesced. But in a letter to Adams, he wrote these words: "Local governments are the civic laboratories of democracy in America." That's us. If you take a look at most of the real change that's occurring in this country today that is truly producing effective results, it's coming from the grassroots up. Local government, state government. Democracy is like a living plant. With the exception of a bromeliad, it doesn't grow downward from the sky. It grows up from the ground. It's in firm roots, and then it comes up. According to an article in the Wall Street Journal several years ago, 76% of all innovation in government at all levels in the United States emanates from the grassroots level. We're the grassroots. Where people live, where they work, where they pray, where they call us when they need help. We teach their kids. We fight their fires. We give them protection. We pave their streets. We plow their streets, etc., etc., etc. Local governments are the civic laboratories of democracy. And de Tocqueville said the same thing in Democracy in America. When he came over to study our government in the 1830s, he was amazed that people got things done without having to go to the king to get authority. I grew up in a small village in Ohio, and I still remember barn raisings. Any of you ever had the opportunity to experience that? When somebody's barn caught fire, all the neighbors got together, built them a new barn. They didn't worry about EPA, they didn't worry about building permits, they didn't worry about zoning, they didn't worry about anything. Just get the guy a new barn. And then when they were all done, they had a big potluck supper. They told them, don't put any more wet hay away again. And that was it. And then they went back to doing their respective things. And it amazed de Tocqueville that Americans were like that. They got things done at the local level. They decided for themselves. They brought about their own future. Cities preceded states, and states preceded the national government. If you think about it, in history, in our country. You're the local champions in that laboratory that Jefferson envisioned. That's the power the 9 of you have, the opportunity you have as to how you go about doing things. And you're entering a phase now in this next 2-year period where you're at the nascent state of being able to sit down now with your new members and your current members and say, where are we going? What is our strategic plan and direction? How are we going to get there? Yeah, we won't get it all done in 2 years, but we can carve out those portions that we intend to contribute during the next 2 years to its ultimate fulfillment. Remember that the prize is always long term. People of Wheat Ridge have put their trust in you for that. That's the governance component, and also you must be good at the listening component. So when you continue your work tonight and from here on in, you have new members now. You're at that stage again where you, as a new team comes together, because new members come in and you have to grow that team again. You have an opportunity to really be bold and bring about magic, power, and genius in it. Thank you. Madam Mayor, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Carl, and team and leaders, and that's very informative and a great way to start out, knowing that we have some wonderful achievements ahead for us, and I think that's why we're all excited to get going at them. So we appreciate your comments. Oh, boy. We're under watch here. Thank you very much. Okay. I guess we can move on to, looks like it's time for review of council rules. And one of the things that we had a suggestion that I think might be a good thing to start with was the suggestion came in that we look at incorporating Robert's rules into as the basic document behind our standing rules for our council. So maybe some discussion on that.
Well, that was my proposal. Obviously, we already use Robert Rules of Order. We just don't ever specifically call it out that way. So this is just sort of a cleanup of that we formally recognize that that's the thing that is guiding our actions. And the other part of that is making the mayor, certifying that the mayor pro tem is the final authority in deciding whether something corresponds to the Roberts rules. So that's that. I did have another proposal too. The other proposal is about just defining a little better
Well,
the way.
maybe we could, is there any discussion or thoughts about using Robert's rules as a kind of our basic document? Because that would be something I believe we would want to, if I'm correct, officially put in our rules, declaring that document is our sort of funding and so that everything that's not covered, if there's holes or whatever, we don't have areas that aren't spoken. Am I understanding that correctly? That's what you're thinking of?
Yeah,
Is there other commentary about that?
I have some input, and I really appreciate your willingness to kind of look through all the rules, and I think that's important. That obviously it says that we have to do that, so thank you, Tim, for doing that. Appreciate it. One of the things that I looked at when we talked about the proposed language in and of itself, that we suggested that Robert's Rules of Order be the guiding document. I proposed a couple of different ways to go about doing that. To allow Robert's Rules of Order to be the reference document, as you will, for the parliamentarian, so that we're not necessarily saying City Council has to at all times adhere to Robert's Rules of Order. Otherwise, we'd all be standing up and down on the dais, and
Right.
there's a lot of things in there. So I'll just pass this around. It kind of walks through what I was thinking, and that we would be able to use that document, Robert's Rules of Orders, as a document to advise the parliamentarian on questions that aren't available within the current policies and procedures or the city charter or the city code. So it's sort of a backstop, if you will, but it doesn't override or supersede
Right.
anything else we're currently doing. And that this amendment kind of walks through what that would look like. And it just makes sure that we're using Robert's Rules of Order in the proper way to fill in the gaps where our current policies and procedures don't address a particular issue.
if I'm understanding you correctly, I just should mention that Robert's rules in and of themselves have a mechanism for ignoring the rules, if you will. So
Are you saying that's sort of built in then?
it is built in. Yeah, there is a mechanism in Robert's rules by which you can suspend the rules. So
And that's, I guess, where if you look at our current rules, our ability to amend our city council rules is by majority. Robert's rules says it's by 3/4 majority. So there's some conflicts inherent in the way that our current rules are written and what is written in Robert's Rules of Order. And so to allow Robert's Rules of Order to be a backstop behind our rules, but not in front of them.
I don't think that there are some things that are require a 3/4 majority. But I don't think that's the general rule. I could be wrong on
I'm
that.
not saying the general, I'm saying for specific, if we were to follow Robert's Rules of Order in amending rules, as a specific example, in Robert's Rules of Order, that says it has to be a 3/4 majority. Whereas in our current city council rules, it says it has to be a simple majority. So that there are some inconsistencies. And so instead of putting Robert's Rules of Order in front of all that, to put it behind us and say, if there's a question that comes up, the parliamentarian is asked to use Robert's Rules of Order to advise him or her in providing clarification as to where we go.
If I may add some more information, if that's all right with council, from what I've read regarding Robert's rules, the 3/4 majority, what that's intended is to protect the rights of the members of the meeting. Where that 3/4 rule comes in, which we sometimes refer to as a supermajority, the idea is that if you're going to change something that affects the rights of the members individually or as a group, that you have to do it with a 3/4 majority. So if anything, it's based to protect us all, so that, such as saying extending debate, that gives you the allowance to extend debate, protecting your ability to do so. So I think that we want to take with a grain of salt that it could be very valuable. I find it very fair, all of the rules that I've read.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tracy.
I guess I just read it real quickly. I think I agree with what you're saying. I see what you're trying to say, is that what Tim said was just adding that guiding document. And what I'm seeing from Zach is that he's saying, well, we'll use Robert's Rules of Order where they don't trump anything else, in the event that they would inadvertently trump our existing rules, and our existing rules then trump that. I like what you put down because it kind of gives a little more detail. It says, really, we're going to use Robert's Rules of Order wherever we can, and when there's really no room for it, we'll go back to what we have. Is that, I mean, am I understanding what you're into? Okay. So I completely agree. I like that we're having the discussion, but I like that what Zach, it's just clarification. It says, okay, hey, when does Robert's Rules of Order really apply? They apply generally all the time. And if they conflict with what we know to be true as our rules, then our rules trump. So I think that you guys both want the same thing. I just think that yours is a little, it provides future clarification for councils who weren't here for this discussion.
Assuming then that we need to place that within our standing rules, would that be correct?
I think your procedure is actually, you have to make official announcement at the next meeting, correct? Regular meeting that that these changes are being proposed, and then you vote on the next meeting.
Actually, the changes have to be printed and put in the packet for council review at the next meeting, then voted on the meeting after that.
The other part was in the rules under B4, general rules. What I did was rewrite item 4 and incorporated item 5 in item 4. So there's no longer a need for item 5. But all it did was define a little better exactly what takes place in each round, so to speak. In the first round, the counselor would state his or her preference on the item being discussed. And then after everyone has had a turn in the second round, people would get a chance to answer what has been said by other counselors in the first round. Luckily, we have a resident English teacher, for which I'm thankful. I hope he's good at punctuation, too, who points out that this seems to mandate that that every person take all the minutes involved here. And of course, I did intend that we all have 7 or 10 minutes of meaningless babbling. And we can change that. But no, it's just a matter of defining how this goes. The first time you discuss your opinion, the second time you answer other people's objections or input.
The only discussion I had with Mr. Fitzgerald was that in the changes, he said will. And so if you took that literally, everybody would have to say 12 minutes worth of stuff. So I recommended shall, or may, or has the right to. And I guess Zach must have caught the same thing and he made a change or something, because it's just, are you passing this out? But he kind of, I guess, caught the same issue, so he made some changes. And the other thing I noticed is that this really, which is not a big deal, but it goes from 3 minutes down to 13 minutes down to 12 minutes, because it was 5, 5, and 3 in the old rules, and this will be 12 minutes total, which that's no big deal. But if you were wondering, if you add them all up, all the minutes, it goes from 13 to 12, but that's not a big deal.
It looks to me like we're talking about on the rules. We're talking about the general rules, and I guess I kind of in the first sentence, sort of going back and to tie this in, we're talking about council members being absent from a meeting, and I'm not sure the discussion we're having now whether these are city council meetings or study session meetings, business meetings, or they're called in here, special sessions, executive sessions. And so I'm not quite sure how to resolve this, but it seems to me if we're talking about these times that and the order and the presentation, that we distinguish that these are city council meetings. And I would offer that as a point of clarification there. And that they would only occur, I guess, in the city council meeting context.
On the dais?
Whether we're on the dais or in a field wouldn't matter, but just that we're at a city council meeting.
It's defined as a council business meeting. Or
Yeah.
the second, fourth meetings.
Well, yeah, but when we're talking about absence from meetings, and then we talk about the right of the floor, we never precede that with what are the rights of the floor, in what context are the rights of the floor? Are they the context of the study session or a meeting, a business meeting?
Madam Chair, I tell you from the past, the study sessions are supposed to be more informal. So the idea was that this type of debate would be happening at a business meeting, so that on the dais at a regular meeting versus a study session. I mean, we may want to clarify that if that's what the case.
That's what I assumed and hoped, but in the effort to get a little bit more clarity, I think we should stipulate somewhere in there that it's a business meeting or a city council meeting.
So section A, absence from meetings is fine because that covers all meetings, right? You want the city clerk to be notified.
That was my question. Is it our desire that we inform the clerk if we're going to be absent from any meeting?
Which includes as defined on page 4, is a business study adjourned special meetings. So do you want that clarified to just business meeting, or just leave it as meetings, which includes all those subcategories?
Well, I'll just speak since I've got my mic on. I think out of courtesy to the group, we should, if you're not going to be there, and no you're not, for any meeting, we should inform the clerk.
So leave it as it is then. Okay.
I guess one element on that absence issue is it referenced listening to a tape in the city clerk's office in order to vote, and I don't know if you have an actual tape, or if that matters, if it's an audio recording, or if someone can affirm that they watched it online, or?
I got that later on when we get to that paragraph, so but that's a good point too, yeah.
Well, just, well, section A so far on page 3, absence from meetings will stay the same, because absence meetings as defined on page 4 includes all council meetings. But right to the floor, I think Councilmember Starker had a question, should that be right of the floor just at business meetings? Do we need to clarify that? Correct, is that correct, Mr. Starker?
Well, that was, I mean, if the rights from the floor, if we're going to talk about what your rights on the floor are, is that only happen at a business meeting, and I would argue that it does. At a city council meeting, and if we call that a business meeting.
Business meeting, yeah.
But there are other.
Thank you. And so I think it is a little bit more complex, because I think to be specific about the edits to 4 and 5, I agree that those should be specifically talking about a council business meeting on the dais. I agree with that. However, presiding officer first must recognize council. I think that should happen in this meeting.
Okay.
Right? I mean, we're even getting away from it a little bit tonight, and that's, I think, just because, you know, not everyone is used to this forum, but you know, this is not a free mic zone, right? I mean, I should be getting recognition. Okay, so I don't know how to. That complicates it to some extent, because I don't think we could just say be right of floor parenthetically at business meetings only, because that's not really, I think, what's going to solve this. Because I think, for instance, item 1 and avoiding item 2, 3, those things actually I think should still be adhered to at other meetings. So I didn't solve anything. Thank you.
I think if you do that, and maybe I'm not right, but then you get into the rule number 4, where we've got 2 times for 5 minutes each, or we have, you know, sort of the timing, and I think that we, to the extent possible, should leave our study sessions to be a bit more informal and flexible, perhaps recognized by the chair to speak in that sort of a context.
On a separate topic from that specific element, I passed around my edits to that specific paragraph. Please ignore the F3 section, because that was what I passed out previously. But the B4 rewrite is my sort of strike through and edit of that particular section. What I tried to do is I tried to match the B4 language to the other language, and that it started off talking about what the council member shall have, and then tried to focus it around the council member, and I made some basic edit changes to use the same phrase as council member instead of counselor, as the rest of the document uses council member. And then I struck out the phrase staff will be allowed sufficient time to respond to the counselor, not that they shouldn't be allowed to, but that may be a separate element somewhere else within the document, because it's sort of a separate topic talking about the right of a staff member versus the right of a council member. And I'm not set on that either way. I just think that that's sort of a separate topic, sort of couched into that paragraph. And then I replaced may where there was a shall or a will, because in legal language, shall means you shall do this, you shall not. You know, so trying to allow some flexibility there, and just making sure that we're giving flexibility to the council member who chooses not to speak. So that was my basic edits there.
I have no objection to the changes to F3. I think they make it better. So I'm good with that. I do, however, the B5 change about the mayor pro tem being the parliamentarian. I would prefer that the line that defines the mayor pro tem as the final authority on Robert's rules stay there. I don't want to ever have us have discussion over, who's in charge of making that decision. So let's just say that person will do it.
And I'll provide you a little bit of clarity as to how I came to that. It's not that I don't agree that the mayor pro tem should fill that role of parliamentarian. It's that the parliamentarian serves at the pleasure of the mayor in this role, in that the mayor is the chair of the meeting, asking the parliamentarian to clarify a particular element that's gone off course or a clarity that's needed on a particular rule issue, and that the chair then accepts that advice of the parliamentarian. So I was trying to solidify the power of the mayor versus giving more power to the parliamentarian. So that was my intent. It should be that the mayor should consider the advice of the parliamentarian, but it's the mayor's ultimate decision as to how everything proceeds. That would be my, I don't know if there's some legal minds.
Excuse me, I need to put that on. I think what we're regarding here too is where a decision has to be made is if there's an appeal. That generally the chair will make a decision if something needs to be done that way. But there could be an appeal to that decision. And that appeal then is usually voted by the council or judged by the parliamentarian. And I think that's what we're trying to get to here. The appeal. So I think we're good here, but I'm not. Do we have any other thoughts? I see
Mayor,
Patrick has
isn't
got
this
something
also
here.
covered in section F under general rules? I mean, it talks about parliamentarian. Are you suggesting you move it to B, or? I'm not sure if I'm the scribe here, so I'm trying to follow all these comments.
Yeah, I know. That's under
Yes,
general
page 4, F, under, I believe, general rules.
Well, under section F, it doesn't. Right, and that's where we specifically say that Robert's Rules is the document that is the document of reference.
That's a proposal you're to include in section F.
Right.
But also, what about the parliamentarian language?
Well, I think, let's see, B5, I see, okay.
I guess
You see what I'm saying?
my
That was an addition that was put on there.
My concern is that the parliamentary definition, so let's look at F2. F2 says the parliamentarian shall advise the chair and members of council on parliamentary rules. And so that advisement of the chair and the council is what the parliamentary's role is. To say that they have final authority means that it's their way or the highway. That's not advisement. That's dictating what is to occur.
But if you don't say that, that means the chairperson would have the ability to ignore parliamentary rules, is what that means, if you take that away.
Well, to confuse it one more time, when we get back on page 7 and we go D, point of order, there the chair shall determine all points of order subject to the rights of any council member to appeal to the council. But I really don't see in here what the appeal to the council is.
Well, a point of order is a part of parliamentary procedure, right? And a point of order would be where one of us would say that something is not going according to the rules, or and so the chair then would make the
The chair then decides if
Right.
the point of order is valid, both describing why they think so, and then a decision needs to be made regarding the point of order, whether
And
the
where's,
appeal is right
and
or
so
not.
where does the parliamentarian fit into that?
Is that what you're thinking of, that the parliamentarian would make that decision?
Well, he has a point.
Right, he does.
You know, the policy call for you here is who do you want to make the final, decision on matters of rules of procedure. And, once you've decided that, there's a bunch of sections and there's kind of a ripple effect and we can make that happen. So maybe the more fruitful discussion is whose word's final? And your choices are, a couple. You can say it's the chair, in the form of the mayor, or whoever's the presiding officer at that time would be the mayor pro tem in the absence of the mayor. Is it the mayor pro tem as the parliamentarian, and then you're done? Clearly what you have now is, I believe, the mayor pro tem being the parliamentarian and advising the chair. So at the moment, the buck stops with the mayor. So maybe the policy, if you make the policy choice, Patrick and I can assist with the wordsmithing in the several places it comes up. But I think the policy choice is really the thing you need to focus on.
And what is the appeal to the council?
Well, it's a motion, like any other motion, but I see that as...
You see that going away?
Probably should, because otherwise you've got, on matters of procedure, frankly, you need to have one person who's saying, all right, I'm ruling that motion inadmissible or improper, whatever, and unless you want to go down a major rabbit hole and sort of argue about that, I would say no. And that brings me back, though, to the main question, which is who's the final word. You're right. I think if you say that, I would recommend that once you pick who the final word is, then you're done, and you don't have the council taking a motion saying that the chair's out of order in making that ruling. You live with that, because otherwise you have chaos, I think. So who should be the final decision?
So just to sum up, the chair can appeal or can make rulings as the meeting goes on. It's only in cases of where she needs consult that the consultor has the final authority. So I think that's the way it should be.
Jerry, I believe the council can make that decision regarding an appeal as well. Is that not correct? That would be a final authority, is that the council themselves say the appeal,
In the past, you've done that. That is right. That's been brought up in the past, that you have done that. The real question here is how much, and this is the overriding question in all of this, how much do you want the rules to be kind of running the show and be the kind of the focus of your debate, and how much do you want the rules to help you make the focus of your debate the topic, whether or not you have back-in parking, or whether or not you approve this funding or not. And council knows what I'm talking about, because you can become awfully preoccupied with kind of the capture the flag aspect of the rules to the point where you've kind of lost track of. So my own personal, sort of staff, let's move on with the real discussion kind of approach would be to make the chair the final word, and then you're done. You stop arguing. But I realize that in the past that's not been the case.
George.
I think I tend to agree with that. If that's what your interpretation currently is of this, which is to say that the chair is the final word and the parliamentarian is essentially the advisor of procedure, and could, under request, help the chair in matters of procedure, but ultimately the chair would have the final word. And that would be personally my preference. I assume that allows for, by the discretion of the chair, for them to put it up for vote if they felt like they're doing that. So I mean, it certainly allows for room. That I think that would be my preference.
Any more?
To clarify, so then that is what Mr. Urban passed out then, correct? The mayor pro tem shall act as parliamentarian advising the chair on questions of order and procedure?
Correct.
Do you want to add then the mayor is the final authority on the
That-
application of rules?
That wouldn't necessarily be under the mayor pro tem's
No.
duties, that would be under the mayor's
Oh, okay,
duties.
okay, gotcha. Okay.
So I mean, as we go through this, I don't know if we need consensus to provide direction, so.
I think that would
Because
be
obviously I've stated something that's not, that is divergent.
in opposition,
Yeah,
right?
divergent certainly from what Tim brought forward, so, I mean, we should ask, I think, for consensus.
Yeah, we'll need you to be mostly on the same page, otherwise what we write up, when it comes to you in your first meeting,
Right.
then you'll be up there on the dais, kind of moving words around, and you want to avoid that much as you can.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I agree with George, but George, you're still suggesting that in a case of a really egregious ruling, the council can still make a motion to override the decision by default. Is that what you're suggesting?
Kind of, not really. So, I mean.
Say yes or no,
it-
please.
Well, I suppose to be fair, no, because in the case of a real egregious ruling where the chair did not allow for council input, then the answer would be no. Again, if the final authority is the chair in that case, then and I guess as written, I mean, it doesn't call necessarily for this mechanism unless maybe I don't understand it. So I think that the answer is no, unless the chair says yes.
Well, I guess my concern would be is if the chair ruled that somebody from the public can't speak, or the chair cuts off a council member speaking, and then they say, I move to override that decision. I mean, you need to have a check and balance there. That's all I'm saying. It hasn't happened very often, but I know in the past.
First of all, remember that rights to appeal or questions or any of those things have to follow basic rules anyway. It isn't like like the chair or anybody else can just jump in and invent something. That you follow a protocol from the get-go. And I think the question before us is, how do we more smoothly get this, if there is an appeal, how to handle it? And it needs to be by the rules.
Well, you could certainly, I'm sorry, I'm violating the rules by not getting, I apologize. You could certainly put a supermajority limit on that one, because that would make it really quite rare. That, you could say the mayor's final authority, except in cases where there's a motion approved by a 3/4 majority of the entire council, which is a pretty high bar, which you would use if the mayor was truly off on a improper frolic.
I'd be okay.
Is that,
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I want to make sure I'm clear in understanding it, because I mean, defining what egregious is, like cutting someone off or something like that, I suppose has some basis in procedure, but that's somewhat about decorum and how to run a meeting. I mean, to me, that's a little bit different. But and so I think to be simple about it, I mean, if we're arguing about the order of a meeting, I think it's fair for the chair to have final authority and for that to be it. I mean, if something bad happens that is somewhat tied to the procedures, but really more about conduct, I think that's something different. So anyway,
The problem, of course, is defining those two categories.
I get it.
So another way to look at it, frankly, is with a supermajority requirement. The mayor rules that, okay, this is the order of the agenda we're going to take. Somebody's upset with that. That somebody's not going to get 6 votes to unwind that, because it's just, just politically, you're not going to get 6 votes to unwind that. But if the mayor cuts someone off in a highly inappropriate way, we've now illustrated the two categories, but the problem is defining them. And the only suggestion I'm making is that you sort of use the politics of getting 6 votes to make those categories, and I think that might work.
So I would offer a consensus so that we can maybe move on. I would offer consensus conceptually that the mayor pro tem acts as the council parliamentarian and advises the chair and members of the council on the rules. I would offer that the chair determines points of order, subject to the advice of the parliamentarian, and subject to appeal by a council member of a 2/3 majority of those members present.
2/3.
I said 2/3.
Or 3/4.
Well, a fraction.
3/4.
So you want to go 3/4? Okay.
Yeah, there's your super majority.
Okay.
Does it
Sorry,
really-
I was working on a 9-person dice.
Yeah,
So.
right.
But so.
Are we
yeah.
good with that? Is there some objection to that consensus? Nope. All right, good.
Did you get all that, Mr. Dahl?
Okay.
Cool.
Councilmember Langworthy?
Okay, so because we did kind of jump back and forth on things, so I want to go back to something we started, but then
All right, let's go
lost.
back. Thank you.
All right, so the right of the floor. I guess I would make a suggestion that we have kind of two rights of the floor. One, the one that we have now, the right of the floor be the business meeting right of the floor. And then we have a separate right of the floor for study sessions that really just include items 1, 2, and 3. Because that's really, I mean, those are the the 3 things that would keep a study session going respectfully. I mean, I guess that kind of takes into what you guys were considering and how do you keep both meetings, business and study sessions. So I would make a consensus to change. Go ahead.
I'm waiting for the chair to recognize people. I'm sorry.
Chair is reading.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Chair still hasn't forgotten that she
Yeah.
has to be a council member.
Well, I
Thank
would,
you, Mr.
I would
Chairman.
sort of second your consensus and say that where we would put that would be under, and I kind of wish that we had a different pagination system, and I don't know, that may be another thing that we could come up with. On
Brain
page
system.
4, types of meeting A4, which talks about the study sessions, that's really where we talk about study sessions. Coincidentally with item number 3 and item number 4, A, and then add those 3 items which I think talk about the right and decorum of the study session.
Certainly, thank you.
I would also entertain the idea of adding number 5 to that. So have it 1, 2, 3, and 5. So it kind of goes back to George's point that you don't want, you do want to provide the ability for everyone to speak before someone kind of takes the reins.
Is that good with everyone?
So should we make a consensus, or are you good?
Can somebody repeat it to make sure everybody's
Okay.
on the same page?
So I would move that we, on page 4, under types of meetings, A, subsection, we would add a subsection to 4. So we have a subsection A, but add a subsection B. That includes number 1, the presiding officer must first recognize each member. 2, speakers shall confine themselves to the questions. 3, members of council shall avoid personal attacks. And 5, no council member shall be allowed to speak more than once. Is that good?
Everybody understand?
George?
Yeah, just a question. Christie, I appreciate where you're getting at. I think it may be hard, actually, when I think about it, in both cases, this item number 5. I'll take it one at a time. So in study sessions, sometimes we're kind of drilling down, in an idea, and we end up, 2 or 3 people might be kind of picking at something, and so by practice, I think we violate that quite regularly at study session, and it might be okay. Now, if the feeling is that that's not okay, then I think it's worth talking about. But otherwise, I think that actually may be a little bit too restrictive for study session, just because of the way we end up batting around ideas. So that's the first thing. Secondly, just to tie it back to this right of the floor, kind of in the context of where we're at right now, it might be that the way the B4 rewrite is, it could be even hard with that because of the questioning piece of this, where you can ask staff questions. I mean, in reality, oftentimes you're asking not rounds of questions, like everyone goes around and asks questions, but I'm going to ask 2 questions or something. Anyway, so it just to separate that, I don't think I agree with the consensus to add number 5 to the study session language, first of all.
I agree.
I think basic Robert's Rules of Order maybe help us with that anyway, because it would be my intention to make sure that everyone did have an opportunity to speak. And I don't know that we have to nail it down, is what you're trying to say?
I agree with George that I think the language in 5 as we have it now is a little bit too restrictive for a study session context. I think another statement that embodied the desire for a free flow of exchange of ideas, respecting the rights of all the members to participate in a discussion, something along that line.
Softer language.
Yeah, softer, more moderate, and to promote a free exchange of ideas amongst the members, respecting the rights of all the members to participate freely in the discussion, as sort of as moderated by the chair, or something along those lines.
I'm not opposed to that change.
Anyone else on that subject? Mr. Dahl, did you get that?
In terms of the notes I'm making, I think what I'll be doing is just making notes about which rules apply to all meetings. And, that's 1, 2, and 3, which would just apply to business meetings, and probably do some reorganizing and also renumbering so we don't have 3 or 4 D4s, because we probably do have that right now. Drives me crazy. So I'll do that. My thought on number 5, honestly, is it works for business meetings, and I've never seen a study session where the rule was even needed. So I guess my reaction to that is maybe you don't even invent a rule for study sessions until you find that it's not working. I've never been in a study session where Rule 5 or anything like it was needed. Anyone else? I'd be inclined to not invent a new rule around 5 for study sessions because I just think they function fine. It's really, they do.
We appear to be having a lot of nodding heads.
All right.
Okay with me.
Shall we go on forward then?
Yeah, what you haven't done, I think, probably is resolve the question of how you want the B4 on page 3 to read, and that's the one that Tim has brought forward, and that. Well, there's Tim's, there's Zach's, and you haven't really finished that discussion. I don't believe.
All right. We were last at your changes, as I recall, which we have written here. Mr. Fitzgerald, perhaps you have some thoughts about that?
Well, to summarize, I think it might be good to clarify, at least it would be for me, to summarize. My proposal was that the mayor pro tem parliamentarian be the final authority. Zach's proposal is that the parliamentarian only be an advisor to the chairperson, and the chairperson be the final authority. And then the further discussion was that the council could override the chairperson by a supermajority. So that, in my mind, those are the 3 issues, or the 3 proposals.
And
So,
as I understand it, that's what we agreed to.
It's this one, I think.
I think we're talking about
talking about
before.
this
Other thing,
Yeah, I think that got agreed to, I believe.
I think we resolved
So
that.
it comes back to, I think what's left is the wordsmithing of that, how many times you get to speak, how many minutes. And I see that Zach has kind of fly-spec Tim's language on that, and I have that, so it's really a matter of you guys telling me that's all right, or it should be changed.
sure, I have no disagreement to Zach's.
My consensus would be to take the best of Tim's and Zach's, which was passed out in wordsmith that to the council rules for the next meeting. You know, taking the Tim and the Zach's with the will versus shall, and then bring that forward.
Yeah.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, we can do that.
Mr. Stover.
I had so I'm looking and talking about what Zach had given us on B4 rewrite, which was an edit of Tim's work. And I had a question that, okay, so each council member shall have the right to ask questions or discuss with staff 2 times. Council members' questions are limited to 3 minutes each. Do I get 2 times, and can I ask as many questions as I can ask in 3 minutes? Does the time for 3 minutes include the question and the answer, or the question only? Or is it really relevant?
My proposal was that the staff response not be subject to a time limit.
And so you could get as many 12-second questions in as you can in,
It's like
2 minutes, I guess.
Well, you could propose your questions of staff, and you could have a little dialogue with them. Is the way I saw it, but they could respond using whatever time is necessary for a full response.
And that was why you put staff will be allowed sufficient time to respond, right?
Other comments on that one? Okay.
I guess my striking of staff will be allowed sufficient time to respond to the counselor was that was interjecting the role, responsibility, right, whatever you want to call it, of a different entity other than the council member. And so it was a little out of place to me, not that it wasn't appropriate, but that it was out of place or should be a separate element somewhere else, that staff time is not calculated or something else to that effect.
Well, you could say questions limited to 3 minutes each, comma, not counting staff response.
That works.
Not including staff responses.
Are we comfortable with that one now?
So that was my consensus, was to move forward with.
All right, I think we've
that-
got that one now. George?
So does that include, I'm sorry, does that include questions and comments, or is it just questions only? I'm sorry to be so.
From what I understand, it's questions only. Staff time was not included.
Right.
And so your question was, can you ask 12 questions in the 3 minutes? And then, which,
Well, or is there a time limit on comments that counselors make?
That's in the debate. As I read how it's been written, that's in the second phase, which is the debate round. There's the question round, debate round.
Okay, so
I think how it's written.
So but you in the first round, you can ask 2 minutes of questions.
Right.
And unlimited comments.
No, I think no comments. I think it's just questions.
So you're limited. You
Yeah.
don't have the right to ask. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's just questions in the first round and then comments
later
in the second round.
Mr. Pond?
Yeah, so everything has to be in the form of a question, period, in the first round.
Yeah.
That's it.
Isn't
Right,
it
so-
true that this is just a...
And it'll be the parliamentarian will decide whether or not that was a question or not, and the chair will be the final.
You can or discuss. So.
So you discuss and then you say, huh, at the end.
I agree with Jerry's consensus to take the best version of these and present that for our discussion and debate later.
Are we good with that? Okay. All right. Do we need to move on with more of these areas?
I have just a couple questions as Mayor Pro Tem as to some of the process to assure that I have the right process. So in this document, it comments to agenda items that you request agenda items to be on the business meeting, but it doesn't address study session. That sits silent. This kind of goes back to just what we were discussing, that it doesn't specify. So
It's on page 9C. that's where that is.
So do we need to clarify that that's study sessions or business meetings? Add study sessions to that? Because it seems like that's what we're doing. I mean, that's what at least that's what I've typically seen. Is that being the case?
Today, that it does say council business meetings, so that would just be your regular meetings, but in practice, we've been doing it.
Yeah, practice, we've been doing it. So I don't know
both
if that we
meetings.
just need to clarify that, so.
Should we just say council, Should we say just council meetings and take out the business?
You'd have to say business and study sessions, I think,
Yeah.
because it's defined
Okay.
as those two meetings. Right, or Mr. Dahl, so would there be anything else?
I want to make sure that, okay, that there's two things going on. For each of those meetings then, 2 items per month. So if I'm a council member, I can originate altogether 4 items, 2 that would end up on the business meeting agenda on either meeting, and 2 that would end up on study sessions. So I've got 4. Right, if you add, I mean, that's the natural result of that, I think, is if you add study sessions and you don't change the numbers, then you've got, I can add, as an individual council member, as long as I can sign someone else up on my team, I can get 2 for study session and 2 for business. Is that right?
Yes, and then I guess for, again, further clarification, because I think it's come up more and of being new to this position, I also want clarification is that my understanding is the items could be requested with the 2 folks or voted on the dais, but then that goes in the queue as far as agenda items, but that's not necessarily a date-specific request. So, for instance, if I were to make 4 requests, 2 for business meetings, 2 for study sessions, a month, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to show up in the month of January or the month of February, whatever month I'm making the request. It's just the 4 requests for those items. So I also just wanted to get that further clarification as a discussion item for the council.
Madam Chair.
Mr. DeTullio?
I think that if somebody wants to add something to the, 2 council members want to add it to the agenda, it probably would be less prioritized as a day specific, but if a motion was made on the dais and council approved that this would be on, the second meeting in November, I think that has more clout because it's a motion by the entire council to put it on rather than just 2 people adding it on. So I think that if it's, like I brought those 2 motions forward, if those would have passed and there was a date in there, I think those would then go on those dates because council has requested that by a motion. But if it's just 2 council people add something, it's not quite as high priority. That's just kind of how
I would agree to that too, because it would be the group of people deciding on a specified date as far as agenda. So that, kind of 2 different things.
And that's correct. There really is a separate rule on the council being able to add agenda items during a meeting, and then you vote on it and you've got a whole council vote. I move that we add this discussion on the March whatever. And if that passes, I believe, unless you want to say it differently, that's sort of a second way you can get an agenda item on. I don't think you're limited by your 2 and 2, originating items outside of this rule we're looking on page 9. I think is separate and apart from what happens in a council meeting. Then it's just the rule of the majority, and if you can get enough votes there, then fine, you can do that there too.
Mr. Starker?
I had a question with that, and looking on page 7, probably B3 then, where it says the mayor pro tem shall have the authority to pull any item off the agenda with the exception of an item placed in the agenda by 2 council members. Would the mayor pro tem be able to trump the will of the council then?
No, I don't think so. I think that this sentence is referring to of course it's awkwardly written, I agree with you, there's a lot of crossovers here. I think that sentence is written with the page 9, 2 items outside of the council meeting rule in mind, so we would need to have a cross-reference. Yeah.
take that, make sure that that's not a trump.
Yeah.
And that kind of gets that. Does that, if I can have a follow-up, I may, are we talking in B3 on page 7 about only council business meetings, or does that apply to study session meetings also?
Good question. I don't know that answer.
Okay.
Okay, we've got a couple things here on the dock.
Does this
George?
apply to?
Well, so just to keep on this notion, if I go back to 9. Sorry, where the heck was I?
6 on 9?
Yes, no, sorry.
Okay. No, that's,
Where were we?
well,
Yeah, sorry. So under C, the first paragraph under C. I guess I just want to be clear. So, Chrissy, you're asking essentially to clean up the language to expand council business meetings and study sessions. And I want to just be clear, and Patrick or Christy or anyone else who's served as pro tem, that going from 2 to 4 is a reasonable thing, because actually, I guess the way I would have read this, just somewhat naively, is that because we have been acting like, this was either for this meeting and or for a business meeting, I was assuming that the 2 was a limit for essentially the whole month. And so I just want to know whether or not 4 is a reasonable thing, or if 2 is okay. Because again, by practice and kind of by my interpretation, naively, I would say that, I would have assumed that this meant 2 for 4 meetings.
instead of 2 for business meetings.
Ms. Langworthy?
2 total for any meeting a month.
So could we change the language then to say regularly scheduled business meeting or study session, so that it limits to 2 per month? And so, because I think it was implied that would be and, but to me, when I heard it, I like you, I was thinking or, not and.
Yeah, and I
would like to clarify.
that's fine, and I just, again, I think it's more, I'm really asking a question. I don't know that I have an opinion yet, because I don't know what's reasonable or not, whether or not, as written or as practiced, 2 is a reasonable limit, or it's reasonable to have 4.
Mr. DiTullio?
I don't think it matters, because council can still make motions on the dice to put them on, so I think 2 is plenty per month. Huh? Yeah, two's fine, and then if council wants to add more, they do it by motion on the dais, so.
Is that by motion and then a second and then voted? Is that?
Yep,
is
like
that what
any
you're
other
saying?
motion, yeah.
Okay.
I have one more question, and it kind of follows up. Zach, did you have something? Follows what Mr. DiTullio was saying, as far as a motion on the dais. Sorry, I'm waiting to be told, speak to the mic. So I guess one of the questions is so we, I'm just going to use the example of present time. So there was 2 motions on the dais, of which they were not voted to move forward to an agenda item. And so and I've read the council rules to see, again, okay, so does that mean, how long can it be till they're an agenda item again? Repeating again, when can we bring it up again? And so just kind of work with me as I talk through this process. But, one of the items I'm questioning or wondering is that if, for instance, people needed more information on the subject, say, for instance, on the motion to add it to the agenda, but they didn't have it, they voted no, but it could have been, an agenda item that really people felt we could talk about at a later time, but we voted no because we didn't have the information. So I'm just thinking to myself, as far as a process, and again, we're kind of beating these kind of to death. So, but even if there was a process where we'd set something that there would be set agenda items, where it could be a process in which we have a list of future agenda items with information that the council member could have provided, let's pretend we wanted to repave 32nd or whatever it might be. I'm just giving some goofy analogy, but then we had some background behind it. I go again to the Historical Society, and perhaps if there was more information, although that's already on the agenda, so it doesn't matter, but say we voted it down. If there was more information, then we could have more information to talk about it in a future session. So I don't know if we want to set up a process when we are making motions on the dais that it provides people more information to make a vote.
Madam Chair, well, there is a process there. If, let's say that failed, which it did, so somebody on the prevailing side can reconsider it, or after 6 months, it can be brought back up, but you can suspend rules by 3/4 majority. So a month later, the time was passed for it to be reconsidered. Someone could say, well, I'd like to make a motion to suspend the rules and add this to the agenda, so the process is there.
Yeah, so I guess my point was more, instead of going through all that process, because it does seem time-consuming and going back and getting prevailing votes or waiting 6 months, do we set something up so that if folks do want agenda items and they want to bring it up for a vote to council, that they're providing council more information to have a better vote as far as what that agenda item's going to be? I'm flexible either way, but I was just thinking of the current day.
Your question is, your thought is, if I understand this right, that an item for the agenda that's going to be brought up by motion would be sort of listed on the agenda as items coming up? Is that what you're thinking?
Permanent, so in a nutshell, a permanent agenda item that would say future agenda items type of situation. You would submit the documentation to the city clerk, the city manager, and that would automatically be on the agenda, and the city clerk could read it and say, future agenda items, here's one, it's in your packet, there's a fair market value analysis of this, and so that it would just be an automatic process, but it would also provide council more time or more information to make a vote. I'm flexible either way, but I think it avoids all the going back 6 months, getting opposing, that type of thing.
Does this have anything to do with, on page 10, C, agenda items, subparagraph 3, during a city council business meeting, under elected officials, city managers, or city attorneys' matters portion of the agenda, or at a study session, a council member, city manager, or city attorney may request that an item be added to a future agenda for consideration.
Yes.
And I guess, is there a difference between a request that an item be added and I guess I don't see what happens after you request that an item be added. Is it added? Do you vote on it?
Yeah, you add it to be voted on.
That doesn't say that, but, and then is there a limitation? I mean, because it says you can do that at any time, or does the two items per month trump that?
Okay, so your suggestion is?
Two different things.
Yeah.
Two different things?
Were you thinking there, is that what you're
So,
thinking?
can you request an infinite amount of times?
Well, I guess a couple of things. What you pointed out is, among other things, the fact there's all sorts of cross-references that need to get fixed, and I'm delighted to really get into that, and you'll see hopefully some procedural, organizational changes that you'll like. But the request 2 items, that's outside of a meeting. And so that's separate apart from getting enough votes to get the thing on in a meeting, or getting enough consensus votes in this meeting to get it on the meeting. And I think that's what 10, or number 3 on page 10 refers to. And you still got to get the votes.
So to clarify that, that's in request, that's really to make
Yeah.
a motion and be acted on affirmatively.
I agree, and we'll change the language to motion or consensus as appropriate. With respect to Councilmember Davis's thought, one and it's for you to decide, but one consideration might be this. A lot of stuff gets suggested to be on the agenda there, and you've put, I think, properly some kind of obstacles to have to overcome so that it's a real thing when it gets there and it's not just kind of one person's idea. And when you think about it, with no pejorative intended, that's really what these steps are for, so that your collective time is best used. And my take would be that if somebody wants to get something on the agenda, thinks about it, puts together the motion, and with no one in mind here, just doesn't do a good enough job about, getting his or her item with enough stuff and doesn't get the votes, then I'm not sure you should have an additional little rule around that to kind of give them another bite at the apple. I think that's reconsideration, or 6 months is a good way to signal to people, look, you got to have it, camera ready when you bring it to us.
Yeah, and my intent to that wasn't necessarily to have a second chance ruling. It was more when that motion is made on the dais, that homework is there in total for someone to make. So you do, so the homework does need to be done. The information needs to be there so that we or myself or the council, whomever is voting, has the information to vote on. So it's almost, to me, my thought was, and it might not even be necessary, was just to more formalize 3, that it would almost just be an agenda item on our business meeting, that if people have additional items that they want to be placed on the agenda, that go on the agenda with their homework for a council vote. So it's not a second chance type of situation.
I see. And that would be fine, but as Councilmember Starker points out on page 10, that's hey, it just occurred to me. We just had this long discussion, and I'm a council member, and it just occurred to me that, I think that we ought to do X, Y, or Z around this thing. I had no idea. It wasn't preordained, but I'm going to make the motion right now. And that would be different than, so now you've got sort of 2 places on a regular agenda where new agenda items get kind of invented. And I'm not sure you should have one place, not,
Can I make a suggestion on maybe cleaning up? There is a lot of, I think, contradiction in a couple of these sections. It seems like it would be easier, even if 2 of you asked to put something on the agenda, it's got to go to the full body to get voted on before staff's going to spend any time on it anyway. So why not just have one section in your council rules that it could be similar to the one that Bud Starker just brought up, where council, the mayor, city council, or the city manager, city attorney could ask for things to be put on the agenda. There's a vote taken. If there's a majority, it gets put on a future agenda. It gives staff then time to prepare for it. And staff has a full authority from a majority of council to spend time on it. This whole two-person thing, it's just adding a step to it, because just because 2 of you put something on the agenda, I'm not going to spend any time working on it until I have full direction from a majority view that staff should spend time on this. Does that make sense? So just the only way you can get something on the agenda is in a study session through a consensus or off the dais, and there's a vote.
Madam Chair.
So it's very simple. Do I understand?
Well, it sounds like what everybody's been saying. I'm just trying to.
Well, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
The reason why that 2 council person rule was put in there is for a minority position to get something on the agenda to talk about, because if the council wants to, they can keep voting everything down that a council person wants to add on the dais. So the idea was that at least 2 people could get it on the agenda to talk about it. So I don't think taking it out completely I think we ought to leave the rules where they are, let the staff amend them up and clean them up, and then bring back and see what the final product is before we take anything out like that. The two council person deal was to support a minority position to get something talked about.
But you could still do that, but right? I mean, it's.
No, because if you make a motion on the dais, it's never going to get passed sometimes.
Because, yeah, you'd have to have a majority.
Further comments?
I agree with Mr. DiTullio that I think we need to be careful about the tyranny of the majority. I guess we need to, and I don't know the answer to it now. Maybe the two-person rule is a good one, but I think it's certainly a concept that we need to make sure that we have sort of a minority. The minority is able to discuss a point of view.
Mr. Pond.
So if I just to stay on this point for a second, I do think there is a balance then between what our expectations are and what the procedure is. So I also agree that we need to protect the minority's position to be able to bring something forward. At the same time, we need to protect staff. You know, we're not like in the business of just making work, you know, that doesn't have a reasonable chance of survival or end date. So just so I know, in kind of practice right now, if two council members are bringing up an item for future agenda through the mayor pro tem, what's happening? How is that coming to us, and what does that look like? Because if you're saying I'm not going to work on it, it just means that agenda is going to show up as a sentence on a future meeting.
The council rules requires that, well, just like the one you and the mayor, or I'm sorry, former mayor worked on. I'm getting better.
We did it tonight.
You're required to put together the backup information. But I just want to make sure that's clear, because sometimes there is some pressure and on staff that they want staff to spend some time researching but that's based on the direction of two.
And I think, just for clarification's sake, if it's not clear here, I think that should not be the case. There should be no direction of staff. It should just be something for conversation.
Yeah,
would it be possible for, if two council members had something they wanted to bring forward, that it would be brought forward at study session, discussed here before it was sent to staff for a future agenda item, so that two council members would have an opportunity to bring forward an issue, but that it would be brought forward at study session, discussed here, maybe a consensus, and then, because I believe that the staff time is very valuable, and it should be a consensus of the majority to forward for them to do any work.
Gotcha. Well, you're right. That's what we did tonight on.
Wait, Mr. DiTullio.
Oh, sorry.
Ms. Langworthy.
Thank you. So, all right, so I have having been in the mayor pro tem position before, my understanding, and so I guess my understanding and what it says here doesn't match. My understanding is that if two people or more have an idea, they're more than welcome to bring it forward to the mayor pro tem. The mayor pro tem will find the most earliest convenient time. I mean, there's always balance. There's other things on the agenda. They try to make a good fit and make sure that your item gets full attention. If you bring something forward and you rush to push it onto agenda, it may be the very last thing done at 10 o'clock at night, where people may not. So there's always that balance. But the other part of it is the two people who have the idea, they're the ones that are responsible for coming up with the backup idea, the backup information. It has never been, or at least never my understanding, that staff was supposed to do that. That is mine. If I go up to you, Bud, and I say, hey, this is a great idea, well, then I better back it up by doing the work. Or if you support me and you agree it's a great idea, then you help me come up with the backup report. But it's never been meant to go towards staff, because it was our ideas. So we were supposed to do the work. So I guess that was always implied, but I guess to clarify it is add language on here that says that if a minority, two people come up with it, they provide the backup report.
That information is in here.
Yeah,
I guess I'm not understanding why we're, because if it's, that's what I thought too, is that whoever comes up with the idea has to do the work. It's not supposed to be put on to someone else's shoulders.
That's found at number 6 on page 9, and as I think about it, that number 6 on page 9 really ought to be moved down to, if you have this two council members initiating, that's where it ought to go. So I can move that.
Yeah.
Okay, can I summarize where I think we are? But if you'll just, I think we've got a system now where there's two opportunities to get something on the agenda. It's either the familiar way with just 2 members can get it on the agenda by going through the mayor pro tem. Is that correct? The other item is that they bring it up as a motion, which the whole council votes on. Now, Mr. Starker.
I think we need to make a distinction in the rules between study session agendas and council meeting agendas.
Okay.
Because I
in
think
any
when you
situation.
say agenda, we're talking about just the agenda that covers both of those kinds of meetings. We have different study session meetings, concepts, and rules. We should have a different agenda concept and something than we do when we're in a business meeting. And I think the threshold level is different. So that's why I'm not sure that we're ready for a consensus on that.
Good point. So, I'm not supposed to say that.
Let me clarify that. Currently, the rules say business meetings, which is just our regular meetings off the dais. So that's what the current rules say. But in practice, we've been allowing it for business and study sessions. So you just need to decide if you want to do it for both. We'll clarify the language.
So I thought we had agreed that we would allow 2 council members to add 2 agenda items a month, either on a study session or a business meeting. And that was good what Mr. Dahl was going to go ahead and add. And I think everything else was covered.
I heard that, yeah.
So,
That's what I heard.
all right,
But is there consensus for that?
what's the clarification problem then?
Is it two council members can add 2 items per month to either or business or study session?
Either agenda item.
And then as I look at it, this is all under the section of, starting on page 8, order of business and the agenda, and we're talking about the order of business, and maybe by inference we're talking about business meetings. So is all of this order of business and the agenda strictly for business meetings? And so then the 2 meetings per month are just business meetings, just council meetings? Or are we going to say, that's most of that is for council business meetings, but we take a few of them and we include those in the study session rules also?
Yeah, I heard the stuff on page 9, bottom page, generating agenda items. That really pertains to both. The 2 items per month it can be on either agenda, so it's kind of a carve out.
That amendment needs to be that language needs to be amended.
Yeah.
To say council business meetings and study sessions.
Yeah, and I've already made that note.
Are we done with that item and ready to move on to something else? Or?
I think it just goes back to what Mr. Dahl was saying as far as how we're referencing in different places, and we just need to clean up the format. Again, that we're not having 2 D4s and 3 D3s, and just cleaning up the format might help.
And I will do that. I will also, unless you direct me otherwise, probably reorganize and create some headings, because you're right, there's apples and oranges, together all the way through this. And I think that might help to highlight when you collect everything that's really under one heading, then you look at it, and I think that might highlight some issues and solutions.
I just wanted to clarify something on item number 4 then. See, that was added by Mr. Pond and I. So our backup for that item was just the memo. And then the consensus in there tonight is direction for staff to do something and spend time and money on it. So to address what Ms. Wooden had mentioned, I think that's how the process would work, is we added it, we're going to talk about it, and then if council agrees, that consensus passes, then staff will actually work on it in due time.
Right. Are we done with council rules, or do we have more? Let's go.
On page 9, C1, just a question for the council. What are standing council committees?
That refers to some, we used to have, we used to have a couple of council committees. We don't anymore.
Do we need it?
I mean,
At one time, we had 2 council committees. One was called the Public Works Advisory Committee, and it had a council member per district. And we had the City Affairs Committee, which had one member per district, and we would appoint each other to be on those. And they were subcommittees, which I thought were very beneficial, where staff would be with that for, and then you would discuss issues and projects and bring that forward, and the standing committee could add that to the agenda. So let's say you and I were on District 1, so you're on City Affairs, on Public Works. We could brainstorm and have smaller meetings and smaller discussions, and then bring that to the council as a group. So 4 of us would say, let's put it to the agenda, and then the whole council would vote on it as a project or issue. So it's called City Affairs. That was anything but brick and mortar, and then Public Works was all brick and mortar.
Well, I would make a consensus that if, you know, when and if we go back to standing committees, that we bring this rule back into place, but if it's currently not, if we don't have those, then I would
Get out. Fair enough.
suggest
With
that
that
we
one,
don't.
anybody? So we're striking that line?
Yeah. And then, Mr. Urban also brought up on page 11, ordinances, resolutions, and motions, number 4, that a council member who had been absent from a prior meeting may vote on a reconsideration, provided such council member has listened to the tape of that agenda in the city clerk's office prior to the motion for reconsideration. And I would sort of amend that to say, you know, or by video or something else, and not necessarily in the city clerk's office.
Because it's all online now, and I would suggest you take out the word tape, insert the word recording, and delete the words in the city clerk's office.
Or say that the council member has affirmed that they have listened to it, or, so you want to make sure the council member actually affirmed that they did that.
Mhm.
And we've done that.
We could take.
Do you think this should be all in capital letters?
I think we could get rid of the caps too.
Yeah, I think it can be in
Put
lowercase.
that in there, wanted it to be loud and clear.
Are we good on that one now? Or are there more changes to the council rules? Or additions, or? Bud's still going? All right. Anyone else? Okay, let's move on to the next item. Technology upgrades, this is a discussion on the tablets.
Yeah, I'll just do a quick introduction. We've had numerous inquiries about this in the past, and we thought tonight might be a good time to bring this back up. Does council want city-issued technology to help with your jobs and potentially reduce paper and hopefully transition us into a paperless council packet? We put a few examples here of what's out there today. Technology has improved. We've been talking about this for years, and before it was just laptops. I think we're getting more council members that are more computer literate and maybe want to use these devices. So is this something you want staff to research further and bring back cost and a proposal, or is this something you're not even want to consider today?
Ms. Davis?
So I know we brought this up a couple times, and a lot of, you know, I kind of do both, and I'll flip back. I do use, like in the meetings, I'll use my tablet to go back to other meeting minutes or other agendas just to check something. But I do like the use of the technology, and I think a lot of it goes back to the paper and how much paper, and if people feel comfortable. I know in the past, one of the items that was not an issue, but perhaps an obstacle was folks downloading it onto their iPad, and maybe if you're not technically as savvy, you know, putting it into your little notebooks or your bookshelf and those types of things was an issue. But I know also from a work standpoint, in my work, we also set something up that's called a Dropbox, which would automatically, the city would just put things in your Dropbox, and then you wouldn't have to seek it out. So basically on Thursday in your Dropbox would be or Wednesday would be the packet. You'd click on it. With that in mind, other things could be in that Dropbox, like the council rules, and other items that kind of makes it easy to go through and navigate. Again, I think it just depends on people's personal preference of if that's easy for them or if they still want the paper. But I do feel that if it's something we do, it probably would be easier for staff altogether if we all go to the iPads or don't, just so that they don't have to manage two processes. But that's just some comments about that.
More commentary? George?
Well, I mean, I'll just share my experience because I've been free of delivery for a year or more at this point, so I haven't taken delivery of a packet for a long time. And it's been fine for me. From time to time, if there's perhaps larger drawings that staff feels that would be better viewed in paper form, they'll go ahead and deliver those, but that rarely has happened, actually. I think I've gotten packets maybe 3 times in the last year. You know, so I think there's an adjustment period. I think I only really carried a paper packet maybe 3 or 4 meetings before I just stopped. But I think it's workable. It's workable on any of these platforms, I would say. I suppose I have a preference for the iPad just because it's what I use, although I'm not opposed to the other platform that's indicated here. I will say that 16 gigabytes, and this will, I'll raise a question inside of this comment. 16 gigabytes actually can be a little bit slim. I've got all of the planning documents for the city on this iPad as well, and I've had to kind of blow, and I've saved every council packet and study session packet. I had to blow them all off because I ran out of room. I use this for work at the zoo as well, so that's probably a complicating factor. But I have got the bike ped master plan. I've got the 38th. I got every guiding document of the city on here that I can pull up at any time. I think that's what makes this valuable, actually, as a tool. This is a 16, and you can fill up a 16 pretty quick if you want to hold those documents. And I think for me it makes sense. I mean, if we're having a conversation, I can literally pull up the bike ped plan right away, and I think that's what, you know, I mean, I've got it on a shelf somewhere that I haven't looked at, but I can't bring it to this meeting except for here. So I think anyway, I've had a great experience with it. I think there's probably a way to transition and to deal with the need for some elements to be paper-based. If we did go with some of these other ones that are indicated, I personally wouldn't go with the mini because it's just too small of a display. But I suppose that could be a choice. But I think I would, 16 gigs would need to be a little bit more. And the only other question inside of that is whether or not, if we were to get these, how we would segregate these for use. Whether they would be dedicated to council use, and that's how you used them, so that and they were managed by the IT department here, so you didn't put up, whatever. I mean, you didn't load it up with other apps. I think that becomes complicated, actually. It's why we don't see a lot of this deployed in our business, because of having to manage the other applications and personal stuff that ends up on here. So I think if we do decide to kind of go down this path, I think it's worth figuring that out. I don't know, and I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's almost impossible not to get this intertangled with your personal life, but that's because because it's a robust tool that does that for you. So.
Okay, more discussion, Zach?
I would say, to the point of the 16 gigabyte, using the Dropbox service, that's eliminated, whereas you can pull it out of Dropbox immediately. And I use that for my business, and I think that would be helpful to have Dropbox, because then you could look it up on your home computer and put it back and then pull it up on the iPad, and it's still there. And so you can manage it from multiple sources, which is what I do in my business. So I think that using Dropbox would be a good application. to use. I think every council member should play Candy Crush at least once. It's not necessarily on these iPads, but just give it a try. Only if I'm speaking. No, but I think that there is some level of responsibilities that we're all adults with respect to other uses for the iPad, as long as we're using it majority for business purposes. I think we're all adults here. As long as you're not, I have little kids at home, I obviously wouldn't let them play with it, but I think we need to be mindful of that. So I would be okay with it as long as it's reducing the cost to the city overall by going in this direction.
Just brainstorming here. If we had 8 new tablets or 9 new tablets, I have the same concern that George and everybody else has mentioned about stuff getting loaded on there and can corrupt it and viruses. Would it be too much for the IT department that they were all loaded up with the information and delivered to the houses versus a packet, and then we just left them here on the night of the meeting, and they got refreshed for the next meeting, so that we're not really ever. I don't want to have a city computer at my house to get stolen or something, or ventilated. So my question would be, can we have them delivered like a packet? They're already loaded up, ready to go, and then everybody would have their own. We just leave them here on Monday night after the meetings. That was just a question. I don't know.
Before I got on council, I sat for 8 years on the State Board of Licensure for Architects, Engineers, and Surveyors, and our packets would frequently run to 2,000 to 3,000 pages, and so we had huge notebooks and boxes that you'd bring. We went to an all digital format, and the way that we did it there was with a disc, and that you would get a disc in the mail, every month. When the package was ready, it was all on disk, and you would put it into your own computer, do it at home or at work or wherever you were doing your work, and then bring your disk to the meeting. And we had laptops at the meeting, and you would plug in there, and then leave your disk there. They would refeed it with the new information, and then send it to you. So that was just another way to get it.
Who currently, do the directors have iPads in the city? Currently has them.
We do. We've started using them at the director level. Nobody else though at this point.
And how are those managed as far as?
We have a policy that we put in place. A lot of organizations are starting to use these more at the manager level, and some councils in different cities are using them, and they all have a written policy on what you can and cannot do. And I think personal use is allowed for the most part, as long as it's not violating any type of whatever. And so we IT doesn't officially manage this for these. We personally bought these with city credit card, and any apps that need to be downloaded, we use the city's credit card, and then we run and maintain the laptop or the iPad ourselves.
So the IT department could help us with all that?
Yes.
I am personally very interested in it because I would be interested in loading other documents that you mentioned, the bike pedestrian plan, that would be useful in having with me instead of these large stacks of papers that you're lugging around. And so I think there's a great benefit to it, and not only for council packets, but for other documents that you may want to access or have on there that you would want for your personal use. So I personally am very interested in it. And
Ms. Langworthy?
So the other thing I think that it would be good for is, if you have all those items loaded on like George already does, if you get that phone call, instead of for me, it would be going upstairs, digging through my file boxes to find, said document. This would, if you had it with you, it'd be easier to pull up information that you wouldn't necessarily be able to have at your fingertips. That might be that difference between, being able to take care of that citizen right then, as opposed to having to hunt it down and then trying to get back into contact with them. Because, you don't always reach them back the first time you call. And so, I mean, I can see a benefit outside of just council meetings. I can see a benefit, throughout your council.
You could set up your mailbox or, your city council mailbox. You can do a lot of things with it.
Mr. DiTullio.
So can the iPads access the city website? Then you can download those documents from the city website, or are you going to load them on there automatically? Like everybody will have the comp plan, or everybody will have a master plan?
I think we would probably investigate using the Dropbox solution because then it wouldn't be taking up the space on your personal iPad. It's on Dropbox's server, so you can download or you can upload as many documents as you want without worrying about the integrity of your iPad.
Yeah, I mean, I think frankly there's two choices because I still wouldn't do it that way, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm on that wireless network right now, and I wouldn't want to wait for it. It's in iBooks. It comes up like that. So I would dance. I would leave some things in Dropbox and some things. And the way I got all of that, including all of the agenda items, is just going through Safari on my iPad to the city's website and uploading it. And that's I think a Dropbox solution is absolutely fine as well. I wouldn't probably do much with it because I like managing it through some of the apps that I have.
I guess the issue that Mr. Tulio brought up regarding not wanting to take the iPad home, he doesn't necessarily have to do that with Dropbox. He can access Dropbox from his home computer and then leave the iPad locked up here and be done with it. If that's what a council member chose to do, they can lock it wherever they want to.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
I just want to say I'm very much in favor of this. We seem to have a lot of Apple aficionados here, but I just want to point out that Android apps have memory cards and you can get keyboards, that kind of thing, and I like my keyboard, so I don't think it necessarily has to be Apple.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
I just have a question about our liability or what the director's liability are at this point. Are they insured, or if you, in the unlikely event that you do
Good question. Stolen.
drop it on the ground and it gets run over by your car, are we personally liable for, a $900 replacement?
We do insure them too. Yep,
Okay.
for those types of damages.
I wouldn't take care of it.
Yep. And I mean, the other option is too, a lot of you already have your own personal devices, so you could choose just to use that still. You can upload things from the city's website no matter what your device is, and you can use Dropbox no matter what your device is. So if you choose to continue using your device, that's fine. Or if you want the city to purchase one, I guess that's your decision as a group.
So it sounds like there's a pretty positive direction this way. Is that sounding good? I have a question, if I may. Wi-Fi only, meaning you have to be in a Wi-Fi facility versus it's.
Yeah, this would be the price without a monthly fee.
Right, okay, that's what
You'd
I
have to be in a Wi-Fi location, which council chambers is. Otherwise, it's about $60 a month, I think, to have a
Okay,
service.
okay.
Yeah.
Sounds like we are pretty much in agreement that we should go forward on this one.
Okay. We'll bring back some options.
Okay, now we're on our last item for the evening. Other than that. Back-end parking. Mr. Pond, do you want to discuss that?
Go ahead.
He's got to pull it up.
I'm working with my technology device. I just have to get back to my chapter. Here we go, back-end parking. Thank you. I'll preface this and then ask if Mr. DiTullio wants to add anything to this. But in its most simple terms, I think this is an opportunity to investigate what the options and perhaps the pros and cons to removing the back-end parking in advance of the implementation of the final design, which, yes, does call for the back-end parking to be eliminated. So, you know, I think everyone's kind of heard some of the reviews of the back-end parking. We've had this conversation before. Again, I don't think that this predisposes us to a certain decision on this, other than asking for investigation on what are the options for removing it, how much would it cost, what's the time frame in which that could happen, and I suppose additively to this, you know, what are the benefits or not of doing that in advance of the design moving forward and the design being implemented. I know we heard several comments at the beginning of the meeting. I appreciate all of them, both the pros and the cons. And I do want to just kind of be clear about one thing, at least as it relates to this issue. I'm not suggesting that we should be spending a lot of money at all on this right now. This is not something that I think ought to be, and this is my opinion, and I could be corrected by Patrick, but that needs to be brought to the design firm, to be executed and cost design fees. But that this is a relatively simple exercise of kind of either Public Works or someone else kind of understanding what it is to restripe, understanding how long that would take and how much that would cost and things like that. So I would hope that in doing this, and the first two people who commented in public comment worried about spending money, this action in and of itself, I hope, is not spending money. I do realize that it would take some staff time to do this, and that's something that we should consider. But I don't think this is really intended to spend any money necessarily, but just to look at some of the options and to bring it back to council and make a decision about whether we would want to do something sooner than the design. Is that a fair statement? You have nothing to add?
Just that this would be, because we know that the implementation of the plan that we talked about is $5.6 to $7 million. Council added Newland to Pierce a couple of weeks ago. So we're looking at maybe 6 months, a year. And I think to help minimize the effects of some of this and minimize some of the chatter in the community about the project, especially folks who are opposed to it, the more things we can do to eliminate that unnecessary diversions as we try to look at other options for funding, especially if we take the plan and take the cost to the voters. It's just one more diversion tactic to get rid of all of the negative that's come out from the back end parking. I mean, we've heard it from a lot of different people. I think it's been at best 50-50, and it's been one of the major complaints about the project, more than even sometimes the lanes. So at least I would like to see at least staff look at it, look at some different options and bring it back. And then if it's not workable, it's not workable. But I'm looking for a compromise or a win-win so we can focus on the real issue and not some of this type of static, like back-end parking and planters in the street and that kind of stuff that just seems to keep reoccurring over and over again with residents and some business owners.
Ms. Langworthy?
Okay. I have a couple questions before I even get to a decision on it. So in that area where the back-end parking is now, can you even make it parallel parking there? Can you make?
Yeah, there's some options, I believe, to put parallel parking. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And then my other question is if you change it from the back-end parking to the face out where you face in park, when you go in reverse, I mean, you still have that bike lane there. So, I mean, if you're looking at taking this back-end parking out but leave the bike lane, then what you have with face-in parking is people on the street riding their bikes, cars not seeing them because their back end is here and they can't see a bike if there's another car next to them. I mean, that's my biggest concern. I get where you guys are going with this. I don't necessarily disagree, but front-end parking to me is not even an option because you have a bike lane. I mean, if parallel parking would work, then that makes a little more sense because then you could at least see those bikes. You have nose in and parallel, and/or.
And to clarify, the city's code currently does not allow front-end parking anywhere in the city, so it would be an ordinance change if you'd want front-end parking.
So it's parallel, that's okay, not front end?
Correct.
Okay, I thought it was the other way around, so I just wanted to clarify.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
The vision of 38th Avenue as a whole has already been approved by previous council and this council. This seems, and we know that even if this is done, it's only temporary because we know it's fruitless because it's going to change anyway. So I think we're just adding inconsistency and confusion to this whole circumstance. We got to put this in perspective. This is only 10 spaces, 10 parking spaces out of a mile-long project. So I'm against this.
Do I have another speaker to say?
It is such a small area along the corridor, and that's one reason I see that asking staff to look into it, I don't feel would be a good use of their time. And also, I am concerned about the impression it might give out that back-end parking was tried. Some people didn't like it, and so now we're going to try something else, and then it's going to go away entirely. And so it seems like a somewhat waste of time that we change something again before it goes away entirely. So I'm not in favor of asking staff to look into it anymore at this point. I'm very anxious to hear what the final plan that we're going to hear about is and how that would be implemented. But due to the small area that it is, I don't see that. Personally, I don't want to request more time of staff.
I guess the counterpoint is that we talk about it being such a small area, but again, that's the area that you all are talking about investing a significant amount of money in as well. It's all very small in relative terms, yes, but the amount of public opposition to back-end parking is significant. A lot of folks, more than not, are against having back-end parking, and if that's going to go away anyway, let's pull the Band-Aid off and let's get rid of it. That would be my perspective. Let's just move on. If it's not going to be part of any future design, whether you're for or against the design, let's just get rid of it now. Why do we have to wait any longer to get rid of it? That's be my consideration.
Ms. Davis?
So everyone knows how I feel about back-end parking. Not a fan, haven't been. I guess my question is, yeah, I do think it's dissatisfier to the community. I guess it seems, to me, I think that to get feedback from the staff, because I do think there's also another plan. So again, I'd hate to take a piece of one plan, do something quick, and then change it again, because I do know when we also get grief for that too. You know, how much did that cost you to change that? And then you turned around and did something else after that. So that would be my concern, is if we take a piece of what was a bigger plan, change this piece, only to change it to something when the bigger plan comes out. So I guess that would be my question. I mean, to me, if we've decided parallel parking's going there, and that's what's going there, then I'd say, let's fix it, parallel parking, done. And I guess my other question would be is the time for staff. I mean, you know, of course, in my brain, I sit and think, okay, how much is it? Pour some asphalt on there, slap it on there, restripe, you know, is it, you know, to me, it's kind of like Christie math, you know, it'd be simple to do. But I don't know that in staff, when you look at the time value of money, if it's that simple for staff. So I'm mixed about it. I do want it to go away. But I also don't want it to go away to then be replaced by something else. So that's just my comments about it.
I had one over here.
Go ahead. I think at our last session, when we gave staff the opportunity or the marching orders to go back take a look at the plan with respect to the parking, not to the parking, but to the bicycle stuff, and really really take another look at the plan and bring something back. I think it adds confusion to the mix, and I don't really think this is I think this program is too much to be able to sort of do in increments. I think to some degree this is micromanaging, and I think that's really not what we ought to be doing as a council. And I will not be voting in favor of the consensus request.
Oh, Madam Chair, I think that, like I said, if it's going to take 6 months to another year to get this plan in place and fund it, the $7 million or $6 million plan that we looked at 2 weeks ago, this is just an irritant that I think, like you said, it's going to go away anyway, so let's get rid of it now. And I think that, to answer Ms. Langworthy's question, that was all parallel parking before it went to back-end parking. And I don't think that, and it's still part of a pilot project, I'm assuming, that's what I've heard, is we're still in the pilot phase. So to respond to some of our constituents' concerns about the back-end parking now, and also remove that irritant so that if we do have to go to the voters for funding of this project, that's one less thing to have to contend with. And if we're looking at 6 months to a year, the back-end parking, it shouldn't be an issue to restripe this to back to parallel. So I think that since we have to have a nose-in parking as a code change, so we don't, that's not really an option because it's going to take 2 readings and everything else. So trying to listen to both sides of this issue and work with both sides of the issue, I think that eliminating the back-end parking and putting parallel parking in would be a good win-win compromise for the community, show some goodwill from the council, and so that both sides are being heard at a consistent basis.
Do you have any more commentary?
I guess the last thing I'll say is that this is asking city staff to look at these options so that then we as a council can make that decision. We're not making that decision this evening. We're giving ourselves the opportunity to consider constituents' needs and wants and issues around this particular concern and addressing it with due diligence. And I think that's what this is saying, we've looked at this is what it would cost, and then we can make a decision. I think that would be appropriate.
A situation now where we have the room a little more divided versus an easy flow. So in this situation, yes.
I don't have a vote on this, so I don't often comment. But I think that back-end parking has been the sore spot with so many people. It's such an obvious attention getter and stigma in the minds of so many people that I don't think it's valuable enough to fight over. I just think it would be better to remove that issue from the mix. Now, on the other hand, you don't want to end up reconsidering each planter one by one and micromanaging in that way, but that's really my attitude from the start. I've thought it's just a tough policy, a tough thing to sell.
Patrick, how much staff time would it take to get dollars on it?
Is
it minimal? I would think it'd be minimal, but again,
it'd be minimal to bring back options. Minimal staff time. I don't know what the cost would be to change
it would be minimal staff time.
staff time. Yeah.
Okay, do I need to actually take a vote on this?
You need to tell me the direction.
Yeah, so let's
I'm sorry.
yeah.
I think we do. Can I get a show of hands who would like to have staff investigate the cost of, as well, I assume, talk to the businessmen. I don't know if they need to be.
Well, we have a consensus in the packet.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So the suggested steps would be I request a consensus. Do I need to read all that?
No, we
Direct
read it.
staff, blah. All right, could somebody read the consensus then, please? All right, Jerry, let's read the consensus.
No, I got it. It's right here. Come on. You guys will all be in this boat soon, so don't. I request a consensus to direct staff to research the options for removing the back-end parking on 38th Avenue and replacing it with other parking options. The options should include pricing and schedules along with any other pertinent information necessary for council to direct staff to implement the changes. Information to be brought back to a regular business meeting in January.
So, we have a question before the vote?
Can this be done in 2 weeks? Because we only have one more meeting in January.
Fine, that's fine.
So maybe we can just take the regular business meeting and take January out.
I guess that's what I would say. I don't want to put a time that maybe not be doable.
Our plan was to, if this was, if we were given direction to bring it back on January 27th, when we discuss the final design period of it.
So you'll bring it to a study session? Okay.
We're proposing to have a special study session after the regular meeting that evening, because we're having so many study sessions canceled here in January because of holidays in February. So we're proposing to have a special meeting after the regular meeting on January 27th to discuss the read that.
So I need, Ms. Davis?
May I just ask that, that pertinent information that's in this motion also include some feedback from some of the businesses that might be affected by these changes in the back-end parking?
Show of hands, please, as to agreeing with this consensus. That's what, if you raise your hand, that means you agree with the consensus. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. And obviously, before the other direction, we have 4 against. I get to make the decision. Well, based on the fact, I need to say why I make the decision. Based on the fact that I don't, my decision is no. And it's because, in my opinion, we are looking like we are undecisive about what we're doing with 38th Avenue, that we are stirring up a pot that we don't need to stir up, that we're spending time as well as money and perhaps irritating the businessmen as well, the business owners. And yes, it would be nice to make that change. It is in the plans. I would like to, as Mr. Carl New just said, we've got a plan. Let's stick with it. Let's hold on to our guns and be the council and public officials who make their determination and stick with it. All right, anything else that we can bring up? We have reports from members of the various, let's see,
Elected officials reports.
reports. Thank you very much.
The Wheat Ridge Cultural Commission Meet the Artist event resumes this Thursday, next Thursday, January 16th, with photographer Blue Hartkop as the featured artist. The event, open to the public, will be held from 5:30 to 7 at Mike's Camera, which is at 3830 Wadsworth. Blue will give a short presentation about his work, and light refreshments will be served.
If we're going to do, so this Thursday is Live Local at the office. It's from 5:30 to 7. So if you want to have food this Thursday, go to the office.